Morning to everybody. The recording says that this is being recorded. Good morning for people from South America and North America. Thank you for coming to the countdown month, the busy month at the end of the year. My name is Maria Rica. I'm a consultant responsible for the culture program in UNESCO Montevideo, representing Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. I'm happy to close the year with this webinar called Cultural Heritage, Immaterial Heritage, Intangible Heritage, organized together with our friends from Mexico, UNESCO, Montevideo, and Mexico and Montevideo UNESCO offices. Thank you for the opportunity to work together on this common project. And the Network for Academic Cooperation in Intangible Heritage and our partners. The General Secretariat from Latin America, SEGIB, the Safeguard of Cultural Heritage of Latin America, and for Latin America and the Caribbean and other organizations that she's in. I'm welcoming you to present the findings from your work. We think this is a key input for development of our region, especially to highlight, analyze, and generate tools to academically highlight culture as a way to make human development resilient. To do this holistically in public policy to overcome the crisis that we're living through. I think this is enough. I'd like to tell you more, but I think that's enough to begin. Remember that this is a webinar, so only the cameras and microphones of the people who are speaking will be enabled. If you're in the Zoom platform, you can have chat access so that you can ask questions and make comments. So please send us questions and we'll try to answer. The meeting is in Spanish with interpretation into English. So when you choose your language to listen, the lower bar lets you choose. This is on Facebook in Montevideo and Mexico UNESCO offices channels. We will publish the English later on. So I'd like to welcome Frederick from UNESCO Mexico. Welcome, Frederick. Thank you, Maria. Hello to everybody. I'm happy to be with you today.
Adelante.
Go ahead.
Si no, presento a Adriana Molano. Adriana Molano.
Introduce Adriana Molano, who's the director of the Regional Center for Safeguarding Cultural Heritage in Latin American Women. Thank you for coming, Adriana. Good morning to everybody. Good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you, Maria, for this invitation. We're very happy in the organization to participate in this webinar to show the fruitful work that we've done this year and the alliance we've generated with UNESCO and different institutions for the last 4 years, strengthening the role of academics in safeguarding intangible heritage. I'd like to say hello to our colleagues here, Enrique Vargas, the coordinator of SEGIB Culture, Pedro Francek, who is from UNESCO for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, and Frederick from UNESCO Mexico. This work enables us to show how important it is to reflect and discuss among scholars from different standpoints to find a complex approach to the complex impact of what we've lived through this year as countries, as citizens in our communities. Safeguarding intangible heritage to enable us to analytically and multidimensionally approach. Because one challenge we have in the pandemic is precisely to understand increasingly this measure, this approach of seeing cultural heritage holistically, to see how we can say that, how we can contribute to finding solutions and finding how culture can contribute to culture, to development, in resilience, in social fabric. This work will enable us to build better instruments for the convention, thinking about the realities of our region. And finally, what we can see with this work is that we're talking about multiple heritage communities, not just the rights bearers, but also scholars dealing with intangible heritage. We think this webinar will be very interesting, very complex, academic, to help the different stakeholders of safeguarding culture, people who are in the field, institutions, to have guidelines and criteria to work better with rights bearers, to work with the different institutions to understand how we can safeguard a way of addressing the pandemic, which will surely continue for many years more. That was my quick presentation just to greet our speakers, and other people will expand. Thank you, Maria, and all of the speakers. Thank you, Adriana. Because of the brevity of time, we're, thank you for being quick. Thank you for being with us. Frederick had a technical issue, but now he's back. Thank you, Miriam. I'm happy to be here. I'd like to begin by congratulating our friends from Colombia, Argentina, and Paraguay. You know that the Intangible Heritage Committee is meeting in Kingston, and Colombia has the great good fortune of having a new member, a new asset on the cultural heritage that requires safeguarding urgently, which is the techniques for pasto varnishing in Putumayo and Nariño, and Argentina with the chamamé. I know that the Argentines were talking about this for a long time, and so we're very happy to see the traditional practice of tereré from Paraguay, which is a beverage in Paraguay. So we're very happy to see the friends here. She's greeting the different friends from the different institutions with the cultural space of SEGIB and Maria Luz, all the different experts who comprise this network of intangible cultural heritage and higher education, and de Castillejas from the Technical Secretariat of the Anthropology Institute, Patricia San Martin, who's the coordinator of the network of academic cooperation with intangible heritage in Latin American and Caribbean, and Emma Pineda, a spokesperson of the indigenous peoples of Latin America, a great Mexican intellectual who represents Latin America for indigenous issues, and Natalia Inez, who's a poet, a scholar in Mexico. I'm happy to be here with you, and the collaboration between Mexico and Montevideo and UNESCO is important coordination, working with the other institutions to combine with higher education and the Latin American Secretariat. We have other networks that are also involved, such as the Asia and the Pacific Network for Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage, the South American Network for heritage and the academic cooperation for intangible cultural heritage in Latin America that we'll hear from them today. It's important to link higher education and intangible cultural heritage, and he's listing all the countries that have joined in this effort. This research meets the need to have models to exchange knowledge among the coordinating, the community, the bearers, and academics. You know better than I do that the pandemic is a major break in our progress. And so, strictly speaking, this is a crisis because, according to the definition, a crisis is the point of change before a new order. Now, we don't know yet how, but the lessons learned from coronavirus are there are so many. It's too early to say that we're finished learning regarding the pandemic, but let's be frank. The hegemonic form of fragmented knowledge and reality in pieces that we have classified and can break up knowledge, this breaking of the bonds that exist naturally between one thing and another in a world in which the parts are linked. We have the connections and the world is on its way. So technological advance is unprecedented. Scientific progress is going behind our fantasies. Science fiction is a reality. And inequality is decreasing in the men and women of this planet. But we have increasing inequality. So we have to come together to work to talk about education and culture in a single time, working together to for other groups, for the indigenous peoples. The world is not broken, it's ailing. We need to find how we can rebuild our linkages. How can we not just be the owners, but only brothers and sisters? For rural communities, for the small communities that are practicing intangible culture and education, this is not separate. We have a single thing all together. This is inseparable. So it's transcendental to all make sure that we can make sure that knowledge can flow without going through the customs or through the hegemony's criteria. In the convention of 2003, there's the convention, but we are returning to look at the link with creativity with the 2005 convention is how all cultures are interlinked. There's no culture that's better than a new culture, nor is there any way that's better than the other. Nature, the, we have 1,000 ways of being, and peoples have of existing. I have nothing more than to thank you for coming. I have special tenderness for this network, and we have an international decade of indigenous languages ahead of us, which are the ways that we communicate, communicate and organize what we know. How wonderful to pull together the pieces of our broken world, then with the words that we speak about flowers. Thank you and good luck with your work.
Muchas gracias, Fred. Como
Thank you,
dijiste, qué
Frederick.
gusto hacer
As you said, it's a pleasure to work together,
tomando en cuenta que
especially taking into account that you were linking with
siempre
the
es un lugar
birth of this network.
fantástico para
So
cerrar
it's a
este año
fantastic way to close
que
out this year
produjo tantas
where
cosas.
the network has produced so many things.
Nos acompaña también el señor
We also have Enrique Vargas, the SEGIB coordinator of culture. Enrique, as a partner of this project, go ahead. Thank you, Maria. Thank you for everybody. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. Dear Adriana, it's good to see you and share once again to speak with you. Dear Frederick, a warm embrace. It's always nice to share with you. And of course, Francet, it's good to be together again at this table in our network at such an important time when I'd like to agree with what everybody has said, that Frederick has reminded us about this crisis means the beginning of an opportunity to get moving so that our communities and our rights bearers will take the step forward that's necessary for taking advantage of the opportunities of the greatest crisis that we have on record. We unfortunately have to say that it's a very difficult time, very difficult, not just at the national level, at multilaterally, at the world level. Our people, our communities, they're having a hard time. This is the reality. And if we start in our communities, we'll be more sensitive to be able to work and continue working with every community member. Of course, I agree in the congratulations that Frederick has made about the new listings on our heritage lists. It's important that despite of everything, that our assets are being included on the list of intentional heritage assets. The committee has highlighted them, and so the holders of our traditions, this is their time. Congratulations to these countries and to everybody, because once again, our region has had the capacity to make their cultural expressions recognized worldwide with the joint work of our institutions that are making these listings and the communities that are making sure that the present application is done well. And scholars, we need to get back to the work of our network. Congratulations to us because we're the ones who are making sure that this is being done properly. Congratulations for each and every player involved in this work. I won't go on too long. I just want to recognize the work of the network. I want to celebrate that we can have this meeting at this end of the year date and that the topic forces us to be here. It invites us to be here and encourages us to be here because this year we've talked so much about the crisis, about the culture sector, about cultural and creative industries, and the negative impact that this has had. It's good to talk about all of that. Yesterday, we presented a progress report on the outcomes of the impact, the findings of the impact of COVID on cultural industries in many of our countries. We have to do this, we have to tell it, we have to measure it. But the impact has not been very visible in intangible cultural heritage. That's something we have to admit. We have to change that and correct it because music and other expressions of culture with culture and industry have been more visible. That's good that they have attention and that we've been able to look at the results, which are not positive, but they're something. There are many proposals, but it's so important that the network and UNESCO and PCI can work day by day, that we can all work contributing what we can do to work on intangible cultural heritage, because this involves our communities. It's clear, our people. It involves those people who, because of confinement, because of the pandemic, have not been able to engage in their practices. They haven't been able to celebrate, to have festivities. community activities normally, and this affects community. This also touches on our communities. Of course, many have not been able to change, but that has been undermined. That reality has been affected. So it's good that we have to reflect about how intangible heritage has been touched on. We have to make it visible in the network, in the institutions, and above all, in this alliance, we have to recognize the alliance that we have to continue favoring as scholars. International agencies have to be closer and closer to academics. I'll always say this whenever I can, because otherwise we can't make the best decisions. So, congratulations for this meeting, congratulations for this presentation, and you're the ones who have to speak. I'd like to address you all our best wishes, not just because of the end of the year, for each of your members of the network. Thank you, Enrique, also for mentioning what we did yesterday. The fact that we're working today is marvelous because it's truly a compliment. One day after another, I hadn't thought that we should pull the two things together, but that's the way that we're doing our work. We're rounding out the work with these two launches, culture and cultural industries, in intangible culture and cultural industries. Now I'd like to give the floor to Francesc Pedro from UNESCO for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean. Francesc, thank you for being with us. Thank you for inviting us and including our institute. I'd like to start by saying hello to the director of Crispial, Adriana, Frederick in Mexico, Enrique in Sechib, and of course, Maria for your support. I have a different perspective. I feel like an outsider in the site of a meeting, and that shouldn't be that way. I would like to declare in the short time that I've been the director of this institute that I'm hoping that I'll maintain this position, that we can establish a smoother relationship. Our contribution is not just another institution. We don't have a specific job in cultural affairs. Our mission is so simple. We have to contribute to improving policies, national and institutional policies about higher education regarding quality, relevance, and equity is very important. You can imagine when institutions started closing down, we haven't stopped working, denouncing the dangers in loss of quality and equity above all in our higher education systems. They're still suffering the results of the pandemic. Unfortunately, our outlook is very difficult. So UNESCO overall, in all the sectors that we're working, should raise our voices to show that there are things that, even though we can't touch them, they're the most important part of people's lives because they make us as human beings. You're going to talk about intangible cultural heritage, that this is part of our heritage. This is the way for propelling our heritage, our culture. As Frederick was saying, that we have to address the crisis as a way of innovation. In higher education, our contribution to heritage, if I may, be so Cartesian. There are three different vectors: training, in research, and whatever we call it, the third mission. In all these areas of higher education, I consider that I'm an outsider, if you like, or a neophyte in this area. We have very important duties in education. It's clear to us that most major universities and the public universities all study programs, one way or another, that are related to intangible heritage are considering and mentioning this heritage. But we have a huge absence. Very few universities have been able to generate specific training about managing intangible heritage and providing it. These are institutions that even if they have a small market or poorly paid, it's not that it's not important. On the contrary, in research, where you're going to present countless results today, I think we have duties that we have pending, the jobs that we still have to do as these jobs have been assigned. We have to not only research what we need to want to see what there is. We know that there are conventions, but we have to move forward by studying the impact of working with intangible heritage on the societal and economic scale. I think that this vector of research that may seem like very related to the scholars who are working together, it's exciting, but it's very important because it's important to make to call to the attention of communities and funders. And finally, the third sector, the social factor, which is the disaster category with different perspectives. Often in the Americas, we have a different view of the third mission, which is could cover the translation of, in economic terms, of the work that universities do in promotion and preservation of heritage. There's an enormous opportunity to create and take advantage of windows of business for tourism. We've seen very little in Latin America, the spin offs from universities, but also I think what we pay the most attention to of the societal engagement is the impact of our work on communities. If I may, excuse me, I'm a neophyte, I'm an outsider, but I don't think we communicate clearly. I don't think we're able to give messages beyond our community of beneficiaries or practitioners. I think we have to construct a public discourse now more than ever to remember how important it is for us to have these reference, the intangible reference for culture during these times of suffering. I think we have to generate a positive discourse. We have to do this more than ever for the simple reason that the panorama that we have with new fiscal measures, without ignoring that most governments in our region are doing everything they can do to overcome health and social gaps, that new fiscal exercises will have bad news for us, for higher education, and perhaps also for culture. So, if I may, once again, we're very clearing and naively and candidly, as an outsider, I think that it's important for activities like this should ultimately generate a discourse to make it positive how important it is that intangible cultural heritage is part of coming out of the crisis. Ultimately, we have to see this as an opportunity to become increasingly humane. I'd like to invite you all from our institute with a strange perspective on the higher education phenomena, may perhaps different from the rest of you. But I would have liked to, as the director of the institute, I would have liked to have data about what's happening in our region in the engagement of universities with intangible heritage. I don't have that data. Maybe you have case studies, but I think we should join forces to put together, as we try to do with UNESCO institutes, to make a study. We don't need a lot of funding. We need to just reach an agreement about what the research questions we are that we need to answer. If we address the data, we're going to be able to thread the needle and be able to have evidence for the positive discourse of evidence-based action that we need more than ever. Once again, congratulations for this work, and I'd like to insist that count on us in the educational sector, higher education, our institute will contribute whatever we can. Thank you. Thank you, Frances. And thank you for coming and for the opportunity to work in this proposal that you've made. This year we've been this coming year we're thinking about precisely what you said. I think we can do it. In your comment about joining forces in UNESCO and all of our different aspects, that we have the Asia and the Pacific. I understand that in the interpretation in English that you see the proposal that we're making, and also we have Zimbabwe and the network for Africa as well, that we should all work together. We're in different natures in different regions. So I think your proposal can multiply. We'll let you know. So thank you, Francesca. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Now we're going to give the floor to our first panel. I don't know if the moderator, Monica Varillo, is here. Did you get your connection working? No, we don't have the leader of that panel. We know that the systems were overloaded. We thought that she'd solved it, but she's not online. So if that's all right, I'm going to um, take over her role. I'll be the moderator for our first panel, which is the role of universities in inclusion of intangible culture in cultural policy, the contribution of higher education in the post-pandemic context. In this panel, we're going to share experience with other regions, and that's why we have the following guests. I'll introduce you, and then I'll give you the floor individually. Warren Kim is a specialist with the Center for Information and Networking for Intangible Culture for the Asia and the Pacific in UNESCO. She's working with culture. She has a master's degree in culture, specializing in education, has been part of the team that launched this type of initiative in another region. It's important to have her with us, and especially it's 2 o'clock in the morning for her. And so we're so appreciative that she's come here because in spite of the time difference. Our second speaker is Jacob Mapara, the director of the Ongoing Learning Institute and Technological Development of the University in Zimbabwe. She's the head of the Indigenous Living Culture Institute. He's one of the members who's leading the SciChanet Equatorial Network, which is like our network here in Latin America. Thank you, Jacob, for being here with us. Our third guest is Aida Castilleja, who's a professor and full-time researcher at the Anthropology Institute. She's a doctor in social anthropology. Since 2017, she's been handling the technical secretariat of the History Institute with anthropology and working with indigenous communities to protect their rights and their territories. Thank you, Aida, for being with us. It's a luxury to have all of you with us. Because you're Mexican, because the huge role of your institute in Mexico and the region. Thank you for giving us time. I would like to then give the floor ask you some questions. I'd like to ask some questions. Everyone can ask questions through the chat function. We're going to start with Boram. Boram, we would like to learn your opinion about whether progress is being made in integrating intangible cultural heritage into the university programs in your region, and if this is highlighting the public agenda and decision making in culture.
Can I start?
Sí, por favor.
Okay, I will share the screen. I cannot hear you.
Okay.
Okay, I will start. Thank you for a nice introduction, Maria. It's nice to meet you again and nice to meet you all. First of all, thank you for inviting me this very important event. This is Boram Kim, an assistant program specialist of International Information and Networking Center for Intangible Cultural Heritage under the auspices of UNESCO. You can call us ENG. As a UNESCO Category 2 center working for ICH safeguarding in the Asia-Pacific region, we have been closely working together with the higher education institutions through UPNH, a university network initiative that is established in 2018. Because I only have 7 minutes, I will get right to the point. So the first question that was given to me was how ICH has been integrated in university programs in the Asia-Pacific region. To respond to this question, I think it would be beneficial to examine the results of the survey that ENG and UNESCO Bangkok office conducted in 2017. So you can see the screen. So I think it's the same in other regions as well. So ICH education has been developing in various fields, including cultural heritage research, art research, anthropology, and even environmental studies. But there was not enough data for us to fully and objectively understand the situation in the Asia-Pacific region, which is why we conduct this survey to identify the status of the higher education programs in the Asia-Pacific region. So with the 37 responding institutions in 18 countries, we could analyze how much ICH is integrated in university programs. As you can see from the screen, the survey classified the universities into 5 categories. So the first category, is made of the university with the degrees or postgraduate programs that solely focus on ICH and include the term intangible cultural heritage. That means they have a dedicated course for ICH safeguarding. The second category related to the institutions that operate degrees or postgraduate programs that are highly related to ICH field. This includes cases involving ICH content in a wide range of subjects such as anthropology, ethnology, cultural studies, intangible heritage management, folklore, and sociology, and etc. And other 3 categories where 19 universities responded include degrees and postgraduate programs that minimally or merely incorporate ICH contents into their programs. So from this survey, we could know that in the Asia-Pacific region, ICH is treated more as a component of a multidisciplinary fields and those that focus on tangible heritage. But at the same time, like 20 institutions responded that they are in the process of developing an ICH related program, and 15 institutions showed their interest in developing an ICH related program as well. So it shows a high interest of university networking. So the Asia Pacific Higher Education Network for Safeguarding ICH, so-called UPNH, has been established in 2018 as a follow-up of this survey. So currently there are 19 institutions, and they are mostly, of course, universities in the Asia Pacific region. And we have conducted various events, including webinar on higher education and field school for the students, and UNESCO capacity building workshops for the professors. And also in 2021, we will organize like a webinar and field school, maybe UNESCO capacity building workshops for the professors as well. So it continues. And the second question that was given to me was how the ICH integration into higher education institutions is reflected in the public agenda and decision-making process in the field of cultural heritage. So to respond this question, I think I can share the Korean cases at 2 levels. First one is the successor training at the university level, and second is education to foster ICH professionals in universities. So all the ICH related activities in Korea are regulated by this act on the safeguarding and promotion of intangible cultural heritage. And it stipulates ICH successor training through universities. So this act was enacted in 2018. It emphasizes successor training through university along with the pre-existing apprenticeship education in order to diversify the transmission system. So in other words, the selection and operation of the schools for successor training was introduced to foster human resource in the field of ICH by incorporating school education into ICH transmission. As you can see from the screen, in particular, Article 30 of the Act, the selection of schools for successor training and other relevant matters explains the scope of the schools that are eligible for successor training and government support. At the moment, 3 universities in Korea have been selected as a school for successor training, and they are conducting training for ICH transmission. So these government support include trainers' salary, program development and operation cost, teaching materials, practical material costs, and scholarship. And one school can receive up to 150 million won annually within a 3-year framework. And second category is the education to foster ICH professionals in universities. So even though ICH teaching is incorporated in various subjects that are being taught in different universities, we cannot talk about fostering ICH professionals at the university level without the Korean National University of Cultural Heritage, KNUCH. Usually universities in Korea are affiliated with the Ministry of Education, but the KNUCH has a unique characteristic as a university belong to the Cultural Heritage Administration. As far as I know, university department dealing with the theory and knowledge system of ICH do not exist anywhere else in Korea and abroad. So with the establishment of the Department of Intangible Cultural Heritage Studies and KNUCH in 2017, it is important to highlight the government's will to foster ICH professionals. And another question was the second part of the question was how this integration affects the decision making in the field of cultural heritage. So many university professors, including those from KNUCH, join decision-making process, especially by participating in the Intangible Cultural Heritage Committee, as stipulated in the Article 9 of the Act. And established to investigate and deliberate on matters concerning the safeguarding and promotion of the ICH, the committee is comprised of up to 30 members, including the chairman. So Article 9.1 of the Act stipulates eligible member as a person who is or was an associate professor or higher at a faculty related to ICH in a university or college. So most of the committee members are professors, which is a manifestation of how influential university professors are in decision-making processes. Essentially, decision-making process include matters concerning the designation of national intangible cultural heritage, recognition of holders, group holders, and selection of a UNESCO intangible cultural heritage. So through the survey that I shared, we are able to learn about the status of ICH education in the universities in the Asia Pacific region, and significantly they are interested in expanding ICH program. I hope that the participants today were inspired by the various training and education related initiatives that Korean government supports at university level. These activities blend both apprenticeship training and trainings and education through formal education institutions. Yeah, thank you for listening. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Boram Kim. Creo que
Thank you, Boram Kim. I think that you've told me very clearly. I wish we had more time. Thank you so much for your summary and for presenting in detail the structure of your policies, the institutional infrastructure you've created in Korea. So now I'd like to give the floor to Jacob Mapara. Thank you, Jacob, for being with us again. And then, like with Boram, we've had another opportunity to exchange. We've been thinking about the network, about the things that we said at our previous discussion. Many guidelines and opportunities will guide our work in the future. And today we wanted to ask you how you think in your place in your region, how you think scholars think about their relationship with communities, and how well community and university agendas can work together for co-construction with local specific features. Go ahead, please.
Hello, everyone. I will share my presentation with you. I hope you will understand the few things that I'm talking about. I was given the two questions out as academia. I think today it's the relationship with communities. And the second question is, to what extent do universities' agenda result from co-construction processes that take into account local specificities? Now, I summarize that into one topic, which is academia's thoughts on the relations with communities and the extent to which universities' agenda is informed by local specificities. Jacob Mapara, one of the coordinators of the SAICHANET, which is Southern Africa Intangible Cultural Heritage Academic Network, based at Chinhoyi University of Technology, CAT, in Chinhoyi, a city to the west of Harare in Zimbabwe. Now, SAICHANET is made up of academics. And of course, before I proceed, I would like to thank Maria for the invitation to share with you our experiences. And as I respond to you, I'm also inviting you to celebrate with us as Zimbabwe and Malawi for having successfully having Mbira Sons, a thumb piano, being enlisted on the representative list yesterday by UNESCO. So that, of course, is a result of the value of academics and the universities being involved in inventorying activities. And I'd like to point out that two of the members who were the lead persons, one in Malawi and one in Zimbabwe, are both academics and they both have PhDs. So it is important that then academia plays an important role. And of course, this comes out immediately after our having had successful early conference on 16 November on intangible cultural heritage by members in both universities and in the private sector and other players on intangible cultural heritage in academia. Now, what I have done is to break the presentation into three major areas. The first thing is to define who the community is. The second thing, of course, is to what are the areas of engagement that we focus on as we work with communities. And of course, the third one is the case of an evolving agenda, the changing environment within which universities operate, and that demand that they change strategies and how they engage with communities. So the first question is possibly, who is the community, or who are the communities? The first thing we notice, of course, in the past, communities were largely those in industry and commerce who were seen as the consumers of the products of universities. So that gave universities a narrow space to focus on and a narrow mandate. But today we've shifted our focus. We realize that communities are made up of both rural and urban communities. Of course, they still include industry and commerce, but we have other players like NGOs, and these NGOs are involved in both community development work, but some are also involved in cultural activities, like those that focus on areas like music, theater, and drama, and other cultural practices. So that is one of the areas that we have defined. But then, what is it that these communities do that relates to higher education and the role of higher education as we progress? Now, what we have observed is that we are dealing with communities now that are now having an input into matters relating to curriculum planning and development. And this is significant, especially when it comes to matters that link up with ICH. It is the communities that dictate or that discuss with academics on what they expect universities to do in matters relating to how they want ICH matters to be handled in the curriculum. It's not just about academics going out to the communities as the superiors, as the knowledge makers, as the knowledge bearers. But now academics now acknowledge that communities are the actual knowledge bearers who may not necessarily be certified, but are better informed than the very academics. We have to learn from them. And as a result of that, we have tried to ask communities what they want, and the result has been, we've come up with short courses that fit into the requirements of NGOs, especially for incoming staff, those who want skills on how they have to engage with communities, because some of these NGOs go out and work with communities, but we are talking of an urban raised person, or we're talking of a person who has been brought under the influence of Western Christian religion, who may not understand the intricacies of cultural practicalities on the ground. And it is these people who are then initiated or taught on how to approach the type of registers, the type of attire, and everything. And participants in all these things are community leaders who come from the culturally informed people. And of course, we embark on training programs accompanied by these people. In fact, we give them space to take lead in those activities. And of course, universities have worked together with communities in ICH inventorying and awareness raising activities. I'll give, for an example, our university, University of Technology. We are currently working on a project on documenting ICH in Urungwe district to the west of the university. After the training and after the impact of COVID and limited gathering, the community has continued to document the material and has been sending us videos and pictures of what is happening in the communities and the changes that are taking place in the communities, especially matters that relate to burial rights and all that stuff, especially given the situation where people are no longer allowed to gather in large numbers. I think in this country, the number has recently just gone up to 100 from initially 25 and then to 50. So these are some of the effects that COVID-19 has been having on communities, and yet the same communities have been engaging our university and of course other universities like Lubani State University to the west of the country, pointing out how they are engaging and participating and carrying out burial rights in the changed circumstances. What we have also realized, what I may need to bring to the attention of this group, is that the issue of course, community engagement is not really something new. We have taken a leaf from the mother university in this country, which is the University of Zimbabwe, where earlier in the 1980s, the University of Zimbabwe's Faculty of Arts had a theater group that worked with communities called Zambuko Izibuko. Zambuko is a Shona word which means bridge, and its equivalent version is Izibuko in the Nguni languages of Ndebele, Zulu, and Xhosa. So that was the bridge that linked the university and the communities. And we've taken a leaf from that. And this is what a SciChanet and a site platform we've taken out to the communities. We've learned from that, and it has been very helpful, not just in Zimbabwe, but as even we look at countries like north of us, we have Zambia, which has introduced a program in ICH. We have Botswana, which has embarked now on some of those activities. The University of Zimbabwe, of course, itself has now introduced ICH elements and ICH programs because of the changed circumstances. We now have what we call Education 5.0. So we have, things are happening in the area of ICH as far as we are concerned. And then I've talked about an evolving agenda, the changing circumstances, where we are seeing our universities moving from that trait of being ivory towers, where they saw themselves as generators of knowledge and consumers only as, communities only as consumers. Now things have changed. We now acknowledge that communities are now co-creators of knowledge and the discourses. They are part of the storytelling, they are part of the history telling. I have an example here of the Pupu Shangani community in Zimbabwe's Montevideo North Province, where recently, as late as 2 weeks ago, the stories that they brought up were assisted and working together with the University of Technology. They have now been acknowledged by the highest office in the land, and there has been an acknowledgement of the role played by their leaders in the 1890s in the fight against colonialism. And this is something that was carried out and preserved through oral stories. And it is these oral stories that the university, working in partnership, of course, with Chino University, with Lupane State University to the west, have helped to bring to light, and it has had these results. And of course, I've already talked about the Urungwe community, where we are also having communities contributing to practices and knowledge that relates to veterinary practices and medicine and how to manage livestock based on their knowledge of plants and other observations that relate to animal behaviors. And now this is feeding into our curricula that relates to agriculture and the development of feed stock. So we are saying here communities are now feeding into a system that originally spanned them, but that is now developing into something that would be beneficial, not just to this local community that, yes, maybe those particular plants, but that can be repackaged and distributed throughout the country. And of course, I've already talked about developing the stock feeds. Maybe what I need to add on to is we are now pursuing a case where we can develop a sporting activity of clay pot racing. It was interesting to note yesterday that I think Saudi Arabia and some other countries yesterday had camel racing and listed as an intangible cultural heritage on the representative list. It is in Zimbabwe, we have women to the south of the country in Chiredzi. They race carrying clay pots for distances of over 400 meters. Now, we think this is something that is worth noting, and we've been talking with those people originally. We really didn't have the push how we could do it, but now there is this inspiration coming from the Arab countries, and we think we are going to follow up on that. And of course, we have also been working in developing a seed that is specifically important for the people to the south of the country. They've asked for a seed, a soham seed variety that would improve their food security. I think that's the little that I can say that relates to how we have been engaging with our communities. I thank you.
Muchas gracias, Jacob, por tu
Thank you, Jacob, for your presentation. I'm happy that we've asked you these questions and to have learned of the work that you're doing and the possibilities to move forward in dialogue among regions. Thank you so much. This makes me very satisfied.
Welcome.
Aida, ya
Aida, back to our region, let's talk about the role that university networks have in this context vis-a-vis the aspects of the pandemic. And you think that it's possible to think about combining what we know in cultural sources and holders and
Gracias.
decision makers.
Muchas gracias a
Thank
todos, a
you.
todas.
To-
Sobre todo, gracias por la
Thank you to
invitación.
each of you
Muchas gracias
for
por la
being here with me.
generosa
Thank you for
presentación,
inviting me
María. Y me
for
da
the
mucho
generous
gusto compartir
presentation.
esta
I'm
pantalla
very happy
con
to
colegas
share
en
my
este
screen with my
evento
colleagues
alentador convocado
at
por
this
la Red de Cooperación
encouraging
Académica en el
event
Patrimonio Cultural
of the
Inmaterial de
Network of
Latinoamérica y Caribe.
Academic
Opté por
Cooperation
no
for
acompañar
Intangible
lo que ahora
Heritage.
compartiré con
I
ustedes con una
agreed
presentación,
not to
como
accompany
quienes
this
me han
with a
antecedido en la palabra.
presentation like what
Espero
we
poder
just
ser
saw.
clara y sintética.
I'm going to try to be
Opté por
clear
hacerlo
and
solo con la palabra y
summarize.
centrar la
I'm
atención
just
en
going to
nuestras
speak
miradas.
so
Una
we can
interacción que
pay
tanto nos ha
attention to
hecho
what we're
falta.
talking about. And we
Si
have to
bien
look at
las
each other.
preguntas son
We need
bastante,
this so
nos
much
llaman, nos obligan
that
a centrar justamente
the
cuál es el
situation is
potencial
forcing
que
us to
debemos
look at the
encontrar, que debemos
potential that we
tejer, que
can
debemos
find, that we can
entretejer en estas redes
interweave
universitarias y en este
in
contexto.
university
Sí
networks.
quisiera retomar algunos
So
de los
I would like
elementos
to get back to
de los
the
que comentó
elements
Federic al inicio
that
de la
Frederick
presentación,
told us about at the
que si
beginning
bien
of his
todos
presentation,
quisiéramos coincidir
that although
en hablar
we would
del COVID
all
como
like
algo
to
que ya
agree to
pasó,
talk about
aun
COVID as
cuando en
something
otros
that's
países van entrando etapas
over,
más promisorias con el avance
when
de la
other
aplicación de las
countries are
vacunas,
moving into
en otros países como los
vaccination
nuestros y
and progress.
particularmente en
In
México,
our
el
country,
rebrote no nos deja
particularly in
ver
Mexico,
en el muy corto
outbreak
plazo panoramas
does
halagüeños.
not
Pero sin
give
duda,
us hope
hablar de
in
la
the short
cultura,
term.
hablar del patrimonio
Talking
cultural
about
inmaterial
culture
es algo que
and
nos obliga a
intangible
hablar
culture
también y a reconocer la
is
resistencia
something
y la
that
resiliencia de estos
forces us to
procesos.
recognize the
Los llamados
resilience of our
alertas son
people.
recurrentes en todos nuestros
We're being
países
warned in all of
y
our countries,
nuestras instituciones están
and
navegando en estas
the
aguas.
institutions are
Unas aguas en donde
navigating,
están atravesadas, pues sí, por las incertidumbres, están atravesadas
working.
por situaciones
We're
complejas, incluso
navigating complex
presupuestalmente,
situations,
pero
even
también
in
dejan
terms of
ver
the budget.
que
But
la
this
responsabilidad
also
que como
shows us
instituciones
that the
dedicadas al
responsibility
patrimonio
of
cultural
institutions that
tenemos
work with
para el beneficio de
intangible
nuestros
culture,
países, de nuestro
we
país en
can
particular,
benefit
pero también de los
our
vínculos que
countries
podamos
and
establecer y
the
hermanar.
linkages
También es
that we
cierto
can build.
que estas condiciones nos han
It's
permitido
also
generar
true
y
that our
diversificar formas de
conditions
trabajo
have enabled us to
inclusivas, incluso
diversify
al
the
interior
ways
de
that we
nuestras
work
propias instituciones y de
inclusively
mayor
in
alcance.
our own
Reuniones
institutions with
como
a
esta
larger
y como
scope.
muchas otras que se
Meetings
han
like
dado en
this
los
one
últimos meses
and
son
other
muestra
ones
de
in the
ello.
last few months
Las interacciones son múltiples, pero
have
no son
multiple
suficientes y
interactions, but that's not
lamentablemente, o no
enough.
sé si afortunadamente, no sustituyen la
This
necesaria
does
dinámica
not
que tenemos que tener en el terreno.
enable us to
El Instituto
work
Nacional de
together dynamically in
Antropología
the
e
field.
Historia
The
es una
National
institución federal que está por
Anthropology
cumplir
and History
82 años,
Institute
que forma
has
parte de
existed
una
for
Secretaría de
82
Estado, de la
years.
Secretaría de
It's a
Cultura.
secretariat
Tiene
of the government,
encomendada
the Culture
el instituto en
Ministry.
su ley orgánica 4
In
funciones
its
orientadas que
law,
están,
there are 4 functions
íntimamente
that are
relacionadas, por eso
intimately
nos es complicado
interrelated.
distinguir o hablar
So it's
solamente
hard
de
for
las
us
de educación. Estas
differentiate this
funciones
from
son la
education.
investigación,
Our
y hablaban
function are
también al inicio de
research,
la
as we said
investigación
at the
y la
beginning,
enseñanza,
research
la
and
investigación, la conservación y
research,
protección, la difusión
conservation,
del patrimonio
protection,
cultural y, por
dissemination of
supuesto, la
cultural
enseñanza en
heritage,
materias de
and
nuestra competencia.
teaching in the areas that
Para el
are
Instituto
relevant to
Nacional de
us.
Antropología
The
e Historia,
National
la atención en el patrimonio
Anthropology and History
cultural,
Institute
con mayúsculas y como un
protects
solo
cultural
término,
heritage.
es un concepto de central importancia desde su origen. Claro está que en el
All
contexto de los
the
últimos 10
origin.
años, por lo menos, ha cobrado relevancia el patrimonio
is
cultural inmaterial,
relevant
tanto en la política pública como en la enseñanza y la
in
formación de nuestros
cult-
estudiantes.
in the teaching
Las
of our
instituciones y
students.
dependencias de la administración pública han integrado de manera
That
explícita
this
en sus
has
funciones y quehaceres el patrimonio cultural inmaterial.
showed that
El
we
reto
have to
ahora es
reinforce
mantener una
cultural
pertinente articulación
heritage,
para evitar desagregar, disgregar,
avoid
atomizar
breaking down
las
and
acciones que deben
fragmenting
orientarse a garantizar y a fortalecer las condiciones que
the
producen, reproducen,
conditions
crean
that
y
are
recrean las múltiples
reproducing
expresiones
and
de la diversidad del
recreating the
patrimonio
multiple
cultural, no como elementos que
conditions of
folcloricen o despojen de su sentido
intangible
profundo de estas
heritage,
experiencias, sino
not
al
just the
contrario,
profound
como
meaning
elementos
of
que
our
les fortalezcan
experiences
y les permitan mantener y
to
fortalecer la cohesión
maintain
social
and
de la que
strengthen
ellos emanan.
the social
Para hablar en particular de
coherence.
las
We're
instituciones
speaking
de educación
particularly
superior,
about the
el Instituto
higher
Nacional de
education
Antropología e Historia tiene
institutions,
3
the
escuelas.
Institute of
La Escuela
Anthropology and
Nacional de
History has 3
Antropología e
schools,
Historia, la Escuela de
Anthropology and
Antropología e
History
Historia del Norte de México y la
for
Escuela
Northern
Nacional
Mexico,
de
and the
Conservación,
National School
Restauración y
of
Museografía.
Conservation,
Estas 3 escuelas de
Restoration and
educación superior
Museography.
están inscritos un
These
total de
institutions of higher
2.700 alumnos,
education,
no son grandes escuelas, la
there
Escuela de Antropología es la mayor,
1,700
pero
students,
tienen programas tanto de licenciatura como de posgrado. Cada una de estas
This-
escuelas tiene sus
these
propias redes, tanto a nivel nacional como a nivel
are the
internacional,
networks,
y
nationally
particularmente
and
en esta última,
internationally,
las de
and
nivel
particularly
internacional, con instituciones de América
internationally with
Latina.
the
Tenemos
institutions of Latin
intercambios
America.
constantes de
We
alumnos, de
have constant
profesores, y pues
sharing of students
lamentablemente
and
durante este año
exchange of
esto se ha
professors.
suspendido y esperamos
This was
no solamente cómo
suspended this year.
reiniciarlos, sino pensar de otra
We
manera estas
are
relaciones. Yo creo que justamente la pandemia lo que nos
trying to
obliga
find
es a
a
pensar
way
cómo relacionarnos
to
de otras mejores y más fuertes
deal with each
maneras,
other
¿no?
more
Sabemos que
strongly.
uno de los grandes retos de las
We know that
escuelas
one
y
of the
de
great
educación superior, y yo
challenges
supongo
of
que en las
our
de sus países también, es que si bien hemos
schools of
podido
higher
y
education
garantizado
is that
la conclusión, que no se interrumpan los
we
programas
have to make
que
sure that the
llevaban
programs
su
will not
propio
be
curso cuando
interrupted.
inició la pandemia, y el
When they
inicio de los nuevos
began the
ciclos en los que
pandemic,
ya hemos iniciado ahora otro ciclo escolar.
we
El reto
have
más
changed the
complicado que nosotros vemos en términos de
cycle
la
of
formación, en
study,
términos de las
the great
investigaciones,
challenge that
pues
we
son las
have
limitaciones
in
que nos ha dado la
research
pandemia en
is the
términos de la
limitations
movilidad
that the
y del
pandemic
trabajo con
gives
las
us
comunidades.
in
El
working
trabajo
with
con las
communities
comunidades es
and
parte
community
absolutamente
engagement,
sustantiva de la formación
which
de
is a
nuestros alumnos.
substantial part
Nuestros
of training,
alumnos, como en muchas
educating our
otras
students.
universidades dedicadas
Like
a estas
many
materias,
universities
se
that work in
forman no
these
solamente
areas,
en las
our
aulas,
students
sino se
are
forman
not only
fundamentalmente
educated
en
in
el campo.
classrooms,
Y la
but
interacción
in
de
the
estas
field,
formas de
and
conocimiento, las del
interaction
aula y las de campo,
this
es lo que va a permitir, pues lo que
sort
siempre
of
permite la formación
education in
de
the field
mejores especialistas
enables
para
us to train
garantizar
better
pues
specialists
todo el conocimiento,
to
pero también
guarantee
la,
all the work
la orientación de
and
una política pública para el fortalecimiento de
public
todo esto.
policy for
El
improving
principal
all of
reto,
this.
pues, es cómo cubrir en este
The
contexto
main
aquellos
challenge
elementos que no se han podido atender por las condiciones de la pandemia.
is that
Insisto, no
what we
solamente
haven't
las
been able to
restricciones
do because of the
presupuestales,
pandemic, not
sino
just
sobre
the,
todo también atendiendo a las limitaciones de movilidad
is
y
that
sobre todo respetando algo que para
limitations
nosotros
in
es
mobility,
absolutamente
we have to
indeclinable,
respect
el
something
respeto de las
we
propias
cannot
comunidades. Sabemos que en estas
ignore. We have to
condiciones hay muchas
expect
comunidades que han optado por sí
there are
mismas
many
a
communities
cerrar
that have
la interacción a personas,
they
a
have
estudiantes incluso,
decided
que
to
no
close
necesariamente
out
están dentro de sus
interaction with
círculos
the
más
students
cercanos, y
because they're not
entendemos que esto
close
afortunadamente, aunque no a una gran
to the
escala,
community.
ha
And so even
contribuido a
though not
mitigar
even on a
la pandemia.
large
Son
scale,
estas
this has
enseñanzas
mitigated the
que sin
pandemic.
duda nos tenemos
This learning
que tener como muy claro, ¿no? Esta
is
misma
becoming very
limitación
clear. This
de lo que
limitation
llamamos de manera genérica
that
trabajo
of
de
what we
campo,
have
pues permea no
worked in the
solamente a las
field,
escuelas, a los
this
alumnos,
permeates
sino a la labor completa que hace el Instituto Nacional de
schools and
Antropología
the
e
work
Historia.
of our
Entonces nos hemos
Anthropology and
dedicado
History
básicamente
Institute.
a llevar a cabo tareas que
We
realmente
are
no
doing work
presenciales, que realmente no podemos posponer para
that we
garantizar la
can't
protección del patrimonio
postpone
cultural
to
que por ley
guarantee
tenemos
the
encomendado.
protection
Pero
of
también es
cultural
cierto que esto nos ha
heritage,
permitido
which is our
generar
job.
otras estrategias que
We
han
have to generate
posibilitado
other
la vigencia y
strategies
urgencia
that
del
have made it
cumplimiento de
possible
nuestras
to
funciones tanto atendiendo a
do our
formatos
work
virtuales o
in
mixtos cuando
virtual
las
or
condiciones lo han
combined
permitido
formats
y en lo posible
when
la reapertura de algunos
conditions allow,
espacios
and
abiertos
if
a la
possible, to
visita
open out
pública. Estas
public
otras
sites.
estrategias, las virtuales,
These
como la que
new
ahora estamos,
virtual
pues también nos han
strategies
posibilitado aumentar de
have
manera
also
exponencial la
enabled us
presencia en
to
plataformas y redes
exponentially increase
sociales. Y consideramos que
exposure
esto sí
in
es un
societal
aprendizaje, digamos, una buena
We feel
secuela
this
de la,
is
de
a
la,
new,
de
a
la
good
virtualidad, en
sequel
donde ya no
of
lo veamos como una segunda
virtual
opción, sino lo
action.
veamos
We don't
siempre
see
como
this
una
as
opción
a
a la
second
par, porque sin
option,
duda
but
pues
it's
garantiza las
another option
interacciones.
because it guarantees our
Estas
interaction.
participaciones en conversatorios, en
This
coloquios, en congresos,
participation
que
in
son los
public
que
discussions
generalmente se han tenido,
and
también ha
forums
abierto
have
experiencias
also
bastante
opened up
interesantes para conocer lo que está
interesting
sucediendo con las comunidades.
experiences
Por el trabajo que tenemos
about what's happening to
en
communities.
terreno, digamos,
In the field,
esto ha permitido
we
tener
have
contacto muy
experienced
directo con muchos de los
direct
actores con los
contact
que
with
colaboramos
many of the
para la
stakeholders
protección
we're
del
working with
patrimonio cultural.
for
Y consideramos que
protecting
esta
cultural
interacción,
heritage.
paradójicamente o no, no sé cuál sea la
Paradoxically,
palabra, ha posibilitado una
this
mayor
interaction has
horizontalidad en nuestras
enabled us to
interacciones. Ha
interact
posibilitado
more
poder
horizontally.
intercambiar experiencias
We can
desde otras
exchange
maneras.
experiences
Tenemos claros testimonios en toda
We
esta
have clear
interacción de peticiones
testimonies,
de que las
testimonials in
comunidades se
our
acercan a
interactions
las
that the
redes que nosotros
communities
hemos construido
come
a
to the
partir
networks that we
del
have
tiempo, de
built
la
over
importancia del
time
patrimonio cultural como elemento
of the
cohesionador de
importance of
comunidades en
cultural
sociedades locales. En el marco
heritage
del
in
quinto Congreso
cohesion
sobre
of
experiencias sobre la
local
salvaguardia del
community
patrimonio cultural inmaterial,
with the
que tuvo que llevarse
safeguarding of
a cabo de manera
immaterial
virtual,
culture,
con las posibilidades y
we've
limitaciones
held
que ello
a virtual
representó,
meeting with the
recuerdo de una manera
limitations
que me
that
impactó
entails.
mucho la voz de una
One thing that
artesana
was very
que
impactful,
compartió
in my
que dejando
opinion,
de lado
a
si ha
local
podido o no
craftswoman
vender sus productos,
says
esto era
that
importante, pero no era lo
she
central.
couldn't
Valoraba el
sell
mantenerse
her
viva,
wares,
ella y
that
su
she was
familia,
glad
pero con
that she was
contundencia
alive, even
comentó
though she wasn't selling her
que al
wares.
voltear a ver una de las
That when
piezas
she
que ella
looked
había
around at
elaborado
one of
sintió
the crafts that
tristeza.
she had made,
Vio
she
con
was
claridad
sad.
que no la
She
consideró
saw
tan
clearly
bonita
that she
como
didn't
ha
think it
hecho
was so
otras
pretty
cuando está contenta.
as the other
Este
one she
tipo de
did when
elementos
she
pues
was
nos
happy.
dejan ver realmente que
These
la
elements
profundidad en
show
la
the
que
depth
desde
of
los creadores de todas estas
the
expresiones,
creators
pues
of
también
these
los
expressions,
procesos que detonan esta pandemia.
of the
Otro elemento que
processes of
también
this
hemos
pandemic.
visto y es también
Another
claro de la importancia del patrimonio cultural
way of
inmaterial
seeing the
es
importance
la
of
incertidumbre que ha
intangible
generado la
heritage is
imposibilidad
the
de llevar a cabo
uncertainty
sus
of
rituales que están profundamente
seeing these
entrelazados con las
rituals
formas
that
de
are
organización social
so
locales.
closely
La eficacia
interlinked
ritual
with
reconocida a
social
estos procesos
interaction.
deja la
The
pregunta,
ritual
¿qué
importance of
sucederá
these
ahora que no los
processes
hemos podido hacer?
about what
No quiero que esta
happens when
intervención
we
esté
can't do
permeada de
them.
pesimismo,
I
pero
don't
me
want to
parece que aún
sound
estamos lejos de pensar
pessimistic,
en
but
un
I think we're a
escenario
far
post-COVID.
cry from
Esta
thinking about
pandemia, aunque afecta a todos,
post-COVID.
no ha sido de la misma
The
manera
pandemic
y ha
has
dejado en claro
affected
una
us
vez
all,
más la
but not all
desigualdad
the
entre
same, and
países
has
y el
shown
interior de
the
cada uno de
inequality
estos, que
between
esta
countries
desigualdad
and
no se
within
ha superado,
countries.
es una
So
desigualdad que lastima y se agudiza en condiciones de enfermedad y de pérdida de vidas. Resistencia y resiliencia son procesos que definen y
I
caracterizan,
have to
señalaba al
answer
inicio,
Maria
los
Frick,
procesos
excuse me.
culturales, a los cuales
Maria,
no son ajenas las
I
expresiones
don't
del patrimonio
control the
cultural.
volume.
Procesos que se suman y de los que se debe aprender,
Yo no controlo el volumen,
que las
María.
instituciones
Tienen que
debemos
subir
aprender
allá.
y particularmente para la investigación y para la
So
enseñanza.
for research
En todos
and
estos
education,
intercambios que
we
ha habido,
have these
hay algo que en términos
exchanges
del patrimonio cultural
that in
inmaterial
terms
queda
of
absolutamente claro, que es lo que desde
intangible
algunos
cultural
momentos, desde
heritage,
algunos
it's
flancos se ha
clear that
llamado como la antropología colaborativa, pero
collaborative
que yo lo
anthropology
concentro más en este
has,
sentido
is the
del
term
diálogo
that
de
they use,
saberes.
but I
Y
think we
esto
have a
creo que
dialogue
tiene
of what
que
we
ver,
know,
no responde
of different
totalmente,
kinds of
pero se
knowledge.
vincula justamente
This
con
is directly linked
llamado
with
a que pensemos
this
estos
call to
intersaberes
think
en la
about
formación de los gestores
the
culturales. El conocimiento no se
relationships
genera de
among
una manera
cultural
vertical,
sectors.
sino se
Knowledge
genera
is
en la
not generated
interacción. Una
vertically, but
interacción
in
en donde la
interaction,
diversidad cultural
where
debe
the
estar
cultural
presente,
diversity
pero también tenemos que
must be
tener claro
present,
que las
but
situaciones de
we have
desigualdad
to
también nos
make
colocan
it
en
clear that
asimetrías que tenemos que tener todo el tiempo
Inequality makes things
muy a flor y que
asymmetrical.
tienen que ser
We have to
elementos que
understand
incidan
this
en
clearly.
la formación
These
de
elements
los
will
especialistas, en la
influence
formación
the
de
training
nuestros
of
alumnos, pero
specialists,
también en nuestra participación
training our
como
students, and
instituciones y como
engaging
docentes.
as
Muchas gracias.
educational institutions. Thank you, Aida. And thank you for mentioning about asymmetries. This is inevitable for our region. And we're accompanying you with the proposal to talk about the dialogue among different kinds of knowledge. This is a topic we have to address in your upcoming event in the coming Congress with your network and with the Mexican community. I think this is something that we all have to think about among ourselves, the horizontal dialogue.
Recién se escuchaba la presentación de Aida muy alto en español, lamentablemente no te pudieron escuchar bien en la interpretación.
She's saying that you couldn't hear me because the Spanish was high. I can't change the volume of the Spanish. You have to put floor, and then you hear the Spanish or the English that they're speaking. But if you change to English, you hear me. So she's asking about the collaboration among the different regions that we have here today. We'd like to exchange among the cultural heritage officers from our different regions. So what reasonable objectives can we share? Not a closed, formal, definite opinion, but what is your feeling about what direction we can go, how we can build a bridge? I'll go the same order as before, and we'll go back to the other. Boram, do you think it's a good idea to work together?
Yeah, of course, we should work together. I mean, I think there are so many opportunities to work together with each other across the continent, especially in the time where COVID-19 changes the way of living and thinking. I think I see even more collaboration opportunities free from physical barriers. Like today's webinar, I wouldn't have been able to attend today's discussion if it wasn't online. So, and I remember that each camp organized a webinar series on higher education, and one session was dedicated to discussing like working together with a different, network initiative from all over the world. And you were there, and I think definitely we can work together. And it is true that the pandemic has slowed down some process, but at the same time, it opens up another opportunities for networking. So I believe we should take this advantage of the current circumstance. So for example, we can co-organize an academic webinar to tackle the issues that different university in each network initiative face today. And in addition, I think to make the cooperation among different network initiative viable, I think it will be very important to have a common practical project that is mutually beneficial, like joint, for example, joint research projects that is counted as an academic achievement can be one example that we can work together. And finally, each CAP is collaborating with the UNESCO headquarters and SDG Academy to develop a massive open online course, so-called MOOC, on safeguarding living heritage and sustainable development. So different themes such as gender and ICT safeguarding and resilience, and etc. will be discussed throughout 25 chapters with a 6 weeks time frame. We aim to open this MOOC course to the public for reaching out to university students and young people with an interest in heritage and development. So, and we also wish to disseminate this MOOC course to the lecturers in the higher educations as much as possible. And I believe that there are many professors and researchers, lecturers who are seeking like online resources for ICT teaching. So I think this course can greatly assist the university professors, and I hope we can promote this MOOC course through the university networks who are attending today. Yes, I hope my answer satisfied your questions. Thank you very much.
Claro que sí, era abierta además.
Of course, it was an open question too. Thank you, Boram. Thank you for these opportunities that you mentioned. We'll continue communicating by email. We like to develop materials from different disciplines and original areas. So we look forward to doing that and working with the network coordinator. Thank you again for being with us.
¿Te parece que hay alguna línea que podamos trabajar juntos?
Jacob, do you think that there's a line where we can work together?
Estás muteado.
Okay, sorry, I was muted. I'll start by saying, in my part of the world, there's a statement: if you want to go fast, you go alone, and if you want to go far, you go with others as part of a team. So that statement emphasizes the importance of working together as a team, and individualism doesn't really pay. So I see benefits that can accrue from universities working together, as well as communities coming together. We can have communities working across the continents. We may be surprised by the commonalities that exist between communities that we take for granted. So really working together, not just as academics, but also giving communities spaces and chances to work together, to find one another. We will be surprised by the results, because there's so much in common that people work on, but although they are working on different continents. Then another thing is, I do also agree that it's important to work together in the academic area, where we can, one, develop a common program where there's, like Boram has indicated, where we can share the teaching loads, and we teach online, and we share experiences. I think in a quickly globalizing world, this is what we would want. Earlier on, I referred to the University of Zimbabwe's Samboko project. We will be building bridges, not just between academics, but also between continents, between groups, and even with the global north. We take stock of the South-South cooperation, but I think we need to go beyond the South-South and look also north. And let also North learn from us as well, those who are in the global south. If it may not be possible in the early stages to develop a common program, then we may have to develop common modules or courses, while members may be given space to develop others that are peculiar to them, but we have to have common modules that we share, that at least help bring our students together, and that also help develop common research areas. And it is these research areas then that will help us come together again as communities. I hope that does make significant contributions to the question.
Claro que sí, Jacob. Muchísimas gracias.
Of course, Jacob. Thank you for building on what Boram said. I think the project would be fantastic to be able to think about some modules. I think we should call it Sambugo, which is a New World word from your language. And one of the key topics that you mentioned that we worked on a lot, that we've thought about a lot in the networks of the region, has to do with agrarian production that you mentioned. I'm not putting this on the agenda, but I think that this is something we have to keep in mind to explore, especially in this context of the world we're living in. Thank you again for your ideas, for seeing what we're doing, and for being in connection. Thank you again. We'll work together. Aida, thinking about the horizontal cooperation that you mentioned, that Boram and Jacob were also talking about, this new reality about horizontal dialogue. I think this is part of the organizations, the possibility to have this sort of conversation. What do you think would be a possible way to interweave these bonds?
Gracias, espero que ahora el audio
Thank you.
sea,
I
no
hope
sea
that
tan
the audio
complicado
is
para
better.
quienes nos
I think
escuchan
you have to be on the
en
English
inglés.
channel.
Quisiera hacerlo en inglés, pero me voy a tardar lo doble y tal vez no voy a ser
So
tan
to
clara.
save time, I
Entonces
won't
pido
speak in
una
English, she
disculpa.
says. So excuse me, we'll do a
Yo lo que
translation.
siento es que lo que percibo de lo
What
que
I
escucho
feel is that
es
from
que
what I can
tratando del
hear, what I
ámbito de las
perceive is that
instituciones
in the area
públicas,
of
privadas,
public and
nacionales,
private,
locales,
national and
regionales,
local,
las
regional
posibilidades son
institutions,
infinitas
the
en
possibilities
términos
are
de las
infinite
posibilidades de interacción, en
in the
términos
possibilities
de
for
los intereses que
interaction
compartimos,
and the
en
interests
términos
that we
de la
share
orientación de las políticas
in the
públicas
orientation
en
of
las que
public
tiene que
policies,
incidir la acción de la
where we
investigación, la
have
acción de
to
la enseñanza. Si no
increase
incidimos en
the
políticas
action of
públicas,
teaching
pues nos
and
quedamos en
research.
una cúpula
If
del
we don't
conocimiento y una
affect
cúpula del
public
saber, que no es
policy,
una
will
cuestión
remain
solamente
an
de
ivory
documentar,
tower.
sino cómo actuar.
But we
Y
have
cómo
to
actuar,
find out
sobre
how
todo
to
en
act
procesos en las que las
in
comunidades de donde
processes in
emerge
which
todo
the
este sustento,
communities
pues llevan
where
sus
we
propios
have
ritmos,
our
tienen
foundation,
sus
they have
propias
their own
dificultades, y
rhythms,
ahí
their
me
own
parece que
difficulties, and I
justamente el
think that
reto mayor
there we
no
have the
está
greatest
qué hacemos entre
challenge
las
of
instituciones,
not
sino
what
cómo
do we do
establecemos de
among
lo que como
institutions, but
señalaba
how do we
Bora,
establish what
y
Boram
Jacob,
said
cómo establecemos
and what
justamente
Jacob
estos
said
puentes, esta
about
comunicación entre
building
las instituciones,
bridges
entre
among
los académicos,
institutions,
con y en
among
las comunidades.
academicians,
Si
and
no
with
tenemos en
communities.
cuenta, si no
If we
asumimos
don't
esto
take into
desde
account,
otras
if we don't
posiciones,
assume that from
vamos a
other
estar
positions,
fortaleciendo el
I
asunto
think we're
de que
going
el
to
conocimiento se genera en
strengthen
las
the matter
aulas,
that
de que el conocimiento se
knowledge
genera
is
solamente desde
generated
la vía
only in
académica.
classrooms
La
and
vía
only
académica es
academicians
absolutamente
know.
central, por supuesto, las escuelas
Academic
son
is
absolutamente
central,
centrales. Y
schools are
las escuelas,
central.
afortunadamente, en nuestros
Schools,
países
fortunately in our
están
countries,
incorporándose
are
cada vez más
incorporating,
profesionistas, en el caso
increasingly,
de México, de pueblos
professionals
indígenas.
in the case
¿No?
of
Entonces,
Mexico from the
esta cuestión
indigenous
de la
peoples.
horizontalidad es algo que se
This
está imponiendo
question of
por diferentes vías, no
horizontal
solamente como un
exchange is
discurso de igualdad,
happening different ways,
sino
not
como
just
algo que
a
realmente nos
discourse of
genera
equality, but
otros
it
retos.
truly
No es una
builds
cuestión
new
solamente de asumir
challenges, not
una
just
manera, un
a
concepto
way
nuevo,
of
sino que tenemos
building
que
in a
pensar
new
en formas
idea, a new
absolutamente
concept, but we have
diferentes
to
de
think
relacionarnos. Y
differently
esto
about
yo
how
creo
we
que sí
relate.
es un elemento
I
que
think
nos
this is
coloca
something,
en
an
un
element
reto de la mayor importancia.
challenges
No
us,
tenemos que
very
tomar
important.
solamente los
We
testimonios de las
don't have to
comunidades
just
para
take
ilustrar algo
testimonials
de
from
lo que las
communities to
instituciones
illustrate
hacemos,
something that
sino tomar esa
institutions do,
vida
but we
de
have to
donde
take that
surgen esos
life
testimonios
where
como
the
el elemento
testimonials
absolutamente
come from
sustancial en el que
that are
nuestras
a
instituciones
substantial
deben incidir.
input to
Entonces, me parece
what our
que cómo
institutions have
generamos
to
esos
do.
puentes, cómo
How do we
generamos esos
make
vínculos de comunicación,
bridges? How do we
tenemos, por
build
supuesto, una
linkages of
responsabilidad
communication?
muy
We
fuerte
have
en hacerlo,
a
pero
very
es una responsabilidad
major
que debemos
responsibility.
asumir con la
We have
escucha
to
y con las
face this
voces también
responsibility by
de
listening
con quienes queremos decidir y
to
sobre
the
todo
voices of the people we
tratándose
want to
del
influence,
llamado patrimonio cultural inmaterial.
especially
Gracias.
in intangible cultural heritage. Thank you, Idea. Now we're finishing out your panel. We're not finished. We're only beginning a new agenda and some new possibilities for UNESCO from Montevideo. My friend Carlos, who's responsible for the cultural program in Mexico, that will be taking my place in a moment. I think I'm speaking for the two of us that we will be back in contact. We're going to think about how we can talk about the things that we're talking about and how we can get them working. Thank you hugely for your participation. Thank you, Boram, Aida, and Jacob. Thank you for being with us at 2 o'clock in the morning, and we'll see you soon. I'll now give the floor to Patricia San Martin, one of the coordinators from the CELAC network, for the second panel about intangible cultural heritage, the findings from the applied research in the network for immaterial culture in Latin America and the Caribbean. Patricia. Well, thank you, Maria. Good afternoon and good night to everybody. Good evening. I'd like to thank you, first of all, for the excellent organization of Montevideo and Mexico organization to hold this meeting and bringing together all you. I'd like to thank Frederick and Maria for promoting our work in the network. It's a pleasure for us to present the preliminary findings from the Cultural Heritage Project and Social Confusion and Inclusion for the COVID-19 pandemic with members of the network that have as partners the UNESCO Montevideo, Crispian, and Sahid, who we also would like to thank them for their contribution. The objective of our project is to generate the guidelines for methodology and analysis of community practices where intangible community heritage is important for exercising their rights. The methodology of our work is interdisciplinary, collaborating with the dynamics of sharing responsibility. We began in June 2020 and will continue working until next September. Developing the project has been at the same time in our network. We're doing online meetings every 2 weeks using video conference through Cristal and Montevideo's UNESCO office. I've been a technician. I'm in the National Council for Research in Argentina and the National University of Rosario. I've been working, sharing the responsibility with Dr. David Gomez from Crispial. The activities we have structured in 2 stages. Today, we're briefly sharing the findings from our first stage. Next, some members of the research team will present summaries of the analytical model of the 6 dimensions that we've developed, mention the key elements of the main variables. Then we'll close this out with the discussions that are happening and we'll mention what results we think that we'll get in the second phase of the project. We're going to start with a video and then we'll present the characteristics of these dimensions. Here comes the video. The Intangible Heritage Model, Social Inclusion, Dimensions and Main Variables. Communication, institution, policies, environmental, society, conserving biodiversity, environmental sustainability, access. She's pointing out that there isn't sound on the video. Now we're going to hear Dr. Virginia Flores from the Catholic University, who's going to give us some information about this dimension. Go ahead, Virginia. She is muted.
Disculpa. Gracias, gracias Patricia. Disculpen, que pensé que lo tenía abierto.
Thank you. Sorry, I thought I was open.
Les voy a hablar un poquito de
Socio-environmental.
cada comunidad tiene una manera peculiar de vincularse con su territorio, donde construye su hábitat,
Everybody has to construct their habitat and
genera las condiciones para su
history
biológico, cultural y social.
for
El conocimiento,
the development
tradicionales,
in their society. The traditional generation by generation have guided,
con el entorno natural a lo largo del tiempo.
and this is in the natural environment.
Se valora la dimensión
And I'd like to value the environmental dimension, sustainability, environmental sustainability, access, the use of the territory, integration of intangible heritage with the territory is for evaluating the impact of intangible heritage on the environment. Biodiversity plays a fundamental role because the native communities and peoples, the way local residents resolve their fundamental needs when they deal with nature, and they conserve their biodiversity and the defense of their territory, as in traditional medicine or food, or
además de muchas de las prácticas sociales como celebraciones y
other,
ritos que también involucran
in rituals,
la importancia de los vínculos sociales, culturales y filosóficos
which
que unen a los pueblos con la tierra y que se asocian a actividades tradicionales es indiscutible.
it's inarguable that they're involved in environmental issues. Sustainability, another variable, is essential for community development. The territory has multidimensional values to produce a group of economic, social, and cultural values. The intangible culture is linked with nature and respecting the environment. Sustainable use of components and fair, equitable use of resources helps universities develop. The other aspect is using territory and combined space. This enables communities to live peacefully with cultural dialogue, respect for cultural diversity, and fair, equitable participation in the use of their territory. Communities must have free access to their territory and they must be heard. Their opinions must be heard about how to use the territory, who should use it, and who should obtain benefits from the territory, because often governmental authorities have different visions than people who live there about how to use the territory and who should have the right to use that territory. Another variable is the use of intangible heritage in use of the territory. This is very important because it's not, territory is not neutral or empty, but it's part of social and urban variables that are constantly changing. Social occupation of geographical space and activities is the gives individuals their appraisal of their territory, and it is involved with cultural heritage. This is part of how the cultural, social, cultural interaction that we have. And finally, evaluation of impact of intangible cultural heritage with the environment is to adjust environmental policies and make cultural and environmental indicators to communicate with the people at large and politicians and make good decisions. This makes it possible to have a process of change in global thinking and integration and nature. based on knowledge and analysis in the complex socio-environmental reality. This can help us solve or at least remediate negative effects on the environment caused by human intervention. We need to make analytical mapping, monitoring, cataloging, and so on. With this, I hope that I can clarify how we're going to approach the socio-environmental dimension. Thank you, Virginia. Now another dimension, please. Another video. Socio-environmental. Socioeconomic, the capacity of resilience of communities. This dimension will be presented by David Gomez from Crespial and from the University of Costa Rica. David, you have the floor. Thank you, Patricia. Good afternoon to everybody. In the socioeconomic evaluation, we start with quality of life depends on people's capacity to meet their needs. This initially means the material basis where they live their life, and then the natural environment where they build and live, and the results of their work activities, socio-political and cultural activities. In this regard, an array of needs from development are made indispensable for social operation. So quality of life has a multidimensional quality. It involves the doing and being of each person. This dimension evaluates the obtaining of economic goals and resilience of communities and economic sustainability of cultural manifestations and benefits the communities get and how they improve their quality of life. Resilience in communities refers to their aptitude collectively to adapt to social dynamics and how well they can meet unforeseen circumstances and the flexibility of their strategies to and capitalizing on these experiences. I'll now give Giselle the floor for the second part of this dimension. Good afternoon to everybody. I'm happy to be in this activity with you. I'll continue with the socioeconomic dimension. We also evaluate the improvement in people's living conditions compared to their culture and material heritage, not just equitable sharing in benefits of economic activities related to this heritage and all the different members of the community, but also how they protect the health of the people who are involved and how to mitigate poverty. So we affirmed the need for equitable benefit sharing between men and women in education, training, and job opportunities in the different societal, ethnic, and cultural areas, and distribution of the benefits from tourism, where a community has heritage assets for tourism. When they become a tourist attraction, this affects the needs of different intermediaries. So the changes by growth in tourism should affect the well-being of the host community. This was decided in 1999. So we have to work with the sustainability of our cultural heritage and resources, not to commodify their heritage as only a source of profit. So safeguarding cultural intangible heritage calls for respect for traditional values, symbolic values, and rather than putting a price on things because that would take away their heritage. We have a series of fora where people have come from different parts of the continent. Adapting to the pandemic, they had the dialogue to consolidate among communities and apply sharing of knowledge from different sorts and sources in the different continent so that we have sustainable, healthful agricultural knowledge and that intangible cultural knowledge is part of health and agricultural prosperity, adding to cultural identity. All of this involves the general variables in this dimension. Thank you, David and Giselle. Now we're going to continue with the video for the next dimension, political and institutional, socioeconomic, political, institutional, mechanism for participation, human rights. This will be presented by Luca Neri, two doctors, both of them from CONICET and the National University of the center of the country in Buenos Aires, Argentina. We're hearing them now. Thank you, Patricia. Good afternoon to everybody. I would like to clarify that we prepared this with Lorma Lebran, who couldn't be here, and Mercedes Mariano. We were working on identifying the dimensions and variables. We'll now share the political institutional variable. Public policies affecting intangible cultural heritage don't work only with the cultural area, but also to ensure other rights, such as public policy for indigenous communities, including recognizing their rights to cultural heritage and intellectual property. So public policy related to gender equality, cultural policy, non-discrimination, decent work in crafts and traditional work, the higher interest of children and adolescents, the right to food, to health, and to education are some of the main ones. This dimension is related to public policy and mechanisms for democratic participation, respect for the rights to citizenship, and decision makers, including the norms for cultural heritage at the different levels of government of each country, and also related to respect for human rights, because this human rights legitimize the elements that must be safeguarded, and cultural heritage, intangible heritage, is an important way to guarantee human rights. When we built this dimension, we felt that it was essential to talk about community involvement in managing heritage. We thought it was very important to distinguish among the different kinds of participation, formal participation through institutional involvement, and other forms of participation such as community involvement that might be formal institutionalized, but through their different practices, activities, and memory activities. So participation was to consider the participation of different stakeholders, those who are in the participation, management, and control of activities and that have been carried out, and the capacity to include heritage recognition, community heritage, and measuring the effectiveness of enforcing standards and policies. So the main Policies and variables for the institutional involvement is public policies, mechanism for participation, human rights, methodology for work, interdisciplinary and inter-knowledge work, and effective implementation of policies and standards for safeguarding cultural heritage. This should, intangible heritage must be evaluated and applied to apply any gaps between intersectory policies and concrete policies.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias,
Thank you,
Mercedes.
Mercedes and Maria Luz.
Continuamos viendo el
And now we're
video
going to
y para
continue seeing the video
acercarnos a la dimensión cultural.
of the cultural dimension.
Quisiera agregar que en esta
I'd
dimensión
like to add that in the cultural dimension, this was going to be presented by Bernardo Guerrero
quien va
from a university. He
a estar hoy,
is going to speak to you,
doctora
and that
de la
Dr.
Universidad
Olga Ticum from the University of the Republic
de último
who
momento no pudo.
wasn't able to attend for personal reasons. Thank you, Bernardo. Thank you. Greetings from northern Chile. To summarize in a few minutes, the idea that we have discussed can be summarized in concepts such as identity, belonging, transmission, perception, and management. These are the key concepts that enable us to understand how communities in times of COVID have shown us that intangible cultural heritage is the cement that pulls together and binds communities and makes them valuable, because when many activities are suspended, the cultural activities that has enabled them to reflect on what they do and their practices. They identify themselves. How do I recognize that I'm a member of my culture? How do I belong? How is my belonging personal? And how is this knowledge transmitted through different formulas and modalities? And also, how can that perception in relation to intangible cultural heritage and our management of that heritage, how can we do our own management? How can the people themselves manage their heritage? Out of gravity, I'd like to thank you again for inviting me to this panel. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bernardo. Now we're going to go with the technical communicational technique.
Y esta
The
dimensión
video shows technical communicational multilingual cyber infrastructure, technical support services. There will be two speakers from the Arturo Prat University. Gonzalo is going to speak. We're going to continue with the presentation about the technical communicational dimension. We think that this is very significant because in current context, communication and cultural productions are very related with each other. Communication and public discussion are essential for interaction among groups and communities and constructing identity individually and collectively. We can't understand how contemporary societies operate without seeing how they access and use communication technology. In this framework, all communication technology is a material support medium with a socially constructed meaning. That technical supporting can be text, graphic, sound, audiovisual, or digital. Technologies enable us to practice expression, information, and public discussion, and also for cultural, socioeconomic, and political work. That's why technology Communication media have a fundamental role for communication and circulation of knowledge and cultural meaning. Not only the mass media, but also internet and the social networks are a part of the political network and circulation of cultural heritage. So at this time, social discussion are through face-to-face discussions and also through multiple communication technologies that are available. Now, Francisco will continue. On the basis of what Gonzalo said, we can say that this dimension has variables regarding the technical infrastructure of a region, access to communication technologies in the different communities, and individual ways of using those technologies. The technologies that we've considered are multilingual capacity. Higher education is to include the different languages that we have in each region, and also the availability of artifacts and systems for communication among different societal groups to produce and access information and express their culture. Another variable is cyber infrastructure, which builds the software and hardware, and capacity for storage of data and working methodologies and collaboration networks. Another variable is accessibility, which shows how relevant it is to have technologies for people who have visual handicaps or low levels of literacy or hearing or bad connectivity, and technical support. For example, institutions have to have specialized technical staff working in the administration of these available technologies. Finally, it's important to highlight that we have to have the skills and way that we use communication technologies in different identities and social communities. Each technology will be relevant only if it's being used. Because since the beginning of the 21st century, that this has spread to all kinds of social practices, we feel this is central to social inclusion in the pandemic and post-pandemic context for work with intangible cultural heritage. Now we finished out this dimension. So thank you, Gonzalo and Francisca. Now we're going to look at the video to one last dimension. Not last but not least, they're all important, which is the educational dimension. Multilingual policies. Hilda de Traga will present this from the University of the Pampa in Brazil. Hilda, welcome. Good afternoon to everybody. First of all, I would like to say that this presentation was also done with the collaboration of our colleague, Jose Severino, who unfortunately wasn't here, wasn't able to be here. With the array of variables involves the effort for activating processes of education for intangible cultural heritage process, intersectorally exchanging knowledge among schools, formally and informally, so that we can guarantee public policy for inclusive, equitable, quality education from human relations and the spaces for community cultural exchange. In this regard, the main variables of this dimension try to analyze and evaluate weaknesses and possible progress in cultural heritage management. The first variable is promoting educational policies that will be inclusive for cultural heritage, pluralistic and democratic view of heritage that's sensitive to the demands of new cultural rights holders. And it also requires special attention for multilingual education and recognition of the native language of communities in Latin America and the Caribbean as part of their heritage and their mother tongue. The relevance of including intangible culture in educational practice, even though this is ordinarily not in the educational pensum in early education. We need curricular orientation policy that will evaluate and strengthen cultural and educational strength of communities and their learning territories. The fourth variable is to make programs and projects to implement and use information technologies and communication, ICTs, within educational institutions to convey intangible culture, because they have their own emergencies, ways of expressing and highlighting their cultural heritage. This has to be reinforced in the pandemic. Finally, implementing programs and projects or recognition of the different pedagogies and methodologies for transmitting and appropriating the cultural goods and services made by communities is where intangible community heritage is indispensable for community development. Thank you. Thank you, Hilda. And of course, now we're going to show the video to show how Dr. Manuel Sevilla from the University of Cali, Colombia, can tell us about the debate currently being held and how we want these different dimensions that we've shown you in our, that we've shown you graphically, are interwoven. We can't have one without the other. We have to see the complexity of this social reality. Manuel is also going to show us some slides. So, Dr. Manuel, you have the floor.
Gracias, muy buenas tardes.
Thank you, good afternoon, and also good morning to everybody. I value your attention. I'd like to show you some discussion that is underway in academic circles to identify some risks and opportunities in the dimensions that we've been discussing. The first one is the dimension of intangible cultural heritage and local development. We're talking about cultural tourism, which is an opportunity, the increasing opportunity, the increase in earning and economic opportunities, and positive valuing of the cultural assets the communities have. However, we're also seeing with some concern that in cultural tourist appeals that there is gentrification and the exclusion of the local people. So this is an opportunity to explore innovative models that will not replicate what there has been and adapt it forcefully, but to think about other ways of managing this heritage. Secondly, intangible colors with the environment. We have to think about protecting our habitat in an integrated manner so that the university and the natural environment go hand in hand, and how intangible cultural heritage can help us make reasonable use of our resources. And some of the panelists have already talked about the opportunities we have in terms of educating new audiences and societal stakeholders, not just to cultural heritage, but also the ways that they relate will be sustainable. Third, profound connection between intangible cultural heritage and educational institutions at the local level. We have the concern about the communication of cultural knowledge. These networks have been interrupted. We have new scenarios to transmit cultural knowledge. It's also important to have education and strength of local institutions for governance. And there's a study that Chris Briel did recently to map different initiatives regarding the convention about transmitting knowledge and local institutions. This is a foundation that we have to take advantage of. We must keep in mind it, on the one hand, the expectation of economic use. It's important to take into account the gaps that we have in terms of intellectual property rights, the importance of community control and participation in decision-making about usage of natural and cultural resources. Simply, in this case, along with what we've been saying here, we have the opportunity for intersectorial work among governmental institutions, the third sector, and universities as a platform for bringing together these initiatives. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Manuel. Now, finally, on the basis of all of this that we've said, in the second phase of the project, we're going to analyze different cases from countries of the region, taking into account the multidimensional integrating view of intangible college and social inclusion. The findings will make the different chapters of a book we'll publish at the end of next year, open access. Finally, we put this in a quick document that we're going to circulate in Spanish and English to make visible the importance of intangible cultural heritage in public policy and in academic context in the region, because we can achieve our goals only if we co-construct sharing what we know. Beyond the tremendous difficulties of the pandemic, we're still here talking about intangible cultural heritage with people who are committed to these issues. This is very motivating to build bridges and call them sambucos. So thank you for everybody in our team. Thank you very much. Good evening. Good morning.
Muchas, a ver. Muchas gracias, Patricia.
Good morning, Patricia. I think this was a presentation of the preliminary findings, but we can see a lot of the items that are going to become concrete tools. As Patricia said, the document that she mentioned will be ready in the next few weeks in English and Spanish. And the result of this work by the network, I would like to take advantage to tell you again, it's a luxury to work with you. A work of such solid scholars, fantastic to work with you because of the process of doing this research. Thank you again. The publication, there's going to be a publication ultimately that we're going to publish by the network. And although they're not here, we'd like to thank Apikun because Olga came along one of the days that we were thinking about this, about how to talk about intangible cultural heritage and social inclusion. What she shared with us was very important. Even though she's not here, I would like to thank her for that. I'd like to make that, um, I'd like to eternally thank her. Then I'll give the floor to my colleague, Carlos Tejada, who's responsible for the culture process in the Mexico office. Carlos. Thank you, Maria. We're moving into the third panel of this seminar. We have been discussing about higher education networks and intentional culture. We're talking about the research with this model of dialogue between different kinds of knowledge among the different parties. Now we have the third module, which is contributions to research into intangible culture by communities. We have three friends, three colleagues, three friends, three partners, three allies from UNESCO and from our office. I'll introduce you very quickly. I won't take any more time away from them. We have Irma Pineda, who's an extraordinary poet and is the spokesperson for the indigenous people in the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Affairs of the United Nations. Enrique Perez is a member of the network of safeguarding intentional culture of that network. She has recently chaired the Mexican Intercultural Network, the first network of this kind. And finally, Natalio Hernandez has belonged to different initiatives, many of them related to UNESCO. He was part of the Indigenous Sculpture Center. He was working with Miguel Leon. He was part of the Association of Writers in Native Languages. And he is in an important project, which is the University of Indigenous Languages of Mexico. They're creating that university. For this panel, the central idea that we have agreed on is that you know that research is a central activity for safeguarding intangible culture. The 2003 Convention says that in researching the linkage between intangible culture and sustainable development is fundamental, and also to take into account and make visible the research and frameworks of research and participation and management of research by the different cultural organizations. We have three major questions for our three speakers so that they can speak, answer all questions, two of them, whatever they want. What do communities currently think about their relationships with academics? And how do communities participate in creating, managing research about intangible cultural heritage, and how can we encourage better knowledge of research and theoretical frameworks and research that communities generate for greater knowledge and to inform public policy. With this background, I'd like to give the floor to Irma Pineda. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you very much for your friends from UNESCO for inviting me, and the director and Frederick here in Mexico. We've been collaborating, and Cynthia as well. I'm very happy to be here with you in this meeting with Enrique and Natalio, who have such background as writers in their own languages, and in the sense that we've been discussing in the different groups that we've heard about the situation of higher education vis-a-vis intangible cultural heritage. I think that we can address the questions that Carlos has mentioned. One thing that we have to see very clearly is that indigenous communities don't worry about scholarly communities. The scholars are the ones, and some indigenous scholars are the ones that are trying to see how to contribute to communities. In Mexico, what I've seen is that in addition to the research that some institutions are doing, those that are living in indigenous communities have greater difficulties in carrying out their academic research, but they're contributing directly to concrete actions. I'll give you an example. The Pedagogical National University from the Isthmus, that's where I work, we don't do research per se. We have many reasons that interfere with our process of research, but the subjects that we teach and the line of specialization in intercultural education and indigenous education and pedagogy and research. In each subject, we're working by projects. So this means that students who come to the university, who are mostly students from 5 indigenous groups, they go back to the communities to work with the communities with these projects. So a number of interesting things happen. One is to make it clear that many of us indigenous people, we don't think of ourselves as indigenous. Many people feel that they're Nahuatl or whatever group. They don't think about indigenous identity, but about their own native group. So people begin with this of recognition of indigenous identity, not just as a political discourse, but being indigenous and recognizing their rights that are established within the Mexican government and international rights. This part is important. How can communities and students start to recognize their identity as indigenous peoples, as well as belonging to their own ethnic group? Another action that higher education is contributing to is that when students go to communities to work on the project, they're doing this specifically with communities. This is one of the great complaints that we've had is that institutions come and they research, but they only take indigenous as informants. So they don't work in their projects directly with the communities. When we talk about students that are indigenous students, we're developing these projects with an agreement with communities. And there we have another interesting situation. Sometimes starting with these projects, the community sees the element of cultural heritage. It's so natural to us to have an archaeological site or our stones, live with the stones, or things we can't touch like our language, our food, our thinking, our traditional knowledge. So we can't touch those intangibles. We don't recognize that they're heritage, and communications, educational institutions are helping contribute to that, to favor recognition by the university of many of the cultural elements. When the community recognizes these elements, there's acceptance of working with students about preserving, strengthening, and developing. And even in some cases, we've had projects that lead to economic processes for the community. But I'm insisting that working with community legitimizes and also enables the community to have knowledge of their elements, their cultural elements, and worry about conserving them. So I think this is one of the great contributions, in addition to the research that we give such weight to. And I've heard in the presentation, I think the direct intervention by higher education with community in terms of recognizing and organizing their cultural elements and working side by side with communities to maintain and develop these elements that are part of the cultural heritage. I'd like to leave it there and we'll continue later.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Irma.
Me llama mucho la atención esta
It's very interesting to me to see the idea of stones that you mentioned, that the stones sometimes it's what happens in the big city is that heritage is what we don't touch. So this contrary concept of heritage is what's actually living and being transmitted and practices and not what you can't touch. So now, Enrique, it's your turn. He's speaking his own language. Thank you all for gathering today to talk about this subject that's so necessary about intangible cultural heritage and higher education institutions. I think it's quite complicated to position myself in research and as part of the indigenous community with the experience of having occupied positions with the community to see how research is done in communities and what do we do, who's involved, what paradigms are hold for these research efforts in communities. In Chiapas, Mexico, we didn't think about research by higher education, but field research by a cultural organization. We did this research for 5 years approximately, where the first exercise was to try to understand in our own language what cultural heritage, what intangible heritage, and not just what you call it, but one aspect that is clashing is to transfer heritage as a topic of research and take it to the community, but rather to look for a concept of our own languages to orient and understand what intangible cultural heritage means to us in our language. In our language, Hasil, for example, in this educational effort that we made with the cultural promoters who speak these languages, we found that in their languages, for example, the closest we could get to intangible cultural heritage was to say something that accompanies our life, something we learn generation by generation. These are the contributions we get from our communities to get into the topic of studying cultural heritage, intangible heritage, not from the foundation of extraction or interpretation of the words of communities, but the communities themselves begin to dig deeper. As one of our elders said in a workshop we held, he said, you have to dig to get to our roots and find our essence. This is precisely what we can do with appropriate methodologies. As Irma Pineda was saying about how universities are collaborating with this process of collaboration with indigenous students or academicians who are indigenous. We did this exercise with students from the Intercultural University, from the academic unit of Chiapas, that people don't have, and we found this during the exercise with them, they don't have knowledge about methodologies that are appropriate to work in research to record and define their intangible cultural heritage. When we worked with students with a approach that enables them to openly dialogue with community members to feel recognized in their expertise as owners of the cultural heritage, that changes the relationship. The researcher, the student, is a co-facilitator for the process. And precisely, this opens out a different dialogue. So, on the basis of the first question, what do communities think in their relationship with academics? I think there's still a feeling that communities are still working as informants, as people that you interview them, they ask them all these questions. We don't have two-way research. The scholar, the researcher, goes to the community, studies it, but there isn't two-way information flow. We see publications in libraries. We find much material of studies done on intangible cultural heritage and indigenous peoples, but they don't come to the communities. During this time of working with communities in Chiapas, we did a series of papers that we published about the indigenous peoples. The people said, where can I get a copy? Can you give me those papers? The materials don't go back. There's no devolution to communities. So we have to contribute to knowing about studies, to strengthen processes of safeguarding culture in communities. So that's why I was saying that it's hard for me to see how to position myself as an academician or as a community member. I think, well, we're doing this research, but it's interesting because we have methodologies, they're effective, and they have in the communities, how are they related to this sort of studies? How do they use the study in their processes of cultural strengthening and growth? There have been experiences that are very successful where there's a dialogue like what we're talking about. There are studies that people don't get, and some there is a dialogue with communities. I think this would be the question, how can we rethink this process? In the case of UNESCO and the 2003 convention, We've talked a lot about establishing a code of ethics, a series of guidelines, directives that could enable us to do our work with greater interaction between the community and the findings of the result of the research. I think that's how we would think with the community. And the next part of the question is what do communities think about sustainable development? I think we're also going to find that there's like two big groups. Those communities that have communications that help them highlight the cultural production, handicrafts, agricultural production techniques and knowledge that can be sold, that can be marketed. There's the trend to work with academicians because they help highlight what culture we can sell, because it makes it possible to market for income. But aside from that, there's festivals and ceremonies that are like the more delicate, complex part. If we see this from a tourism standpoint, we can see that festivals and ceremonies can be sustainable, but for whom? So that would be the question. For the rights holders, for musicians, for dancers, how do they benefit from tourism if we see tourism as sustainable development? So I'll leave it there. We can go into this further next time.
Muchas gracias, maestro.
Thank you, Master.
Investigación de doble vía.
With two-way research, I think we have to talk about that in the next part. I'd like to give the floor to Master Natalio Hernandez.
Está apagado su
Your
micrófono.
microphone is off.
Del cual Teotlac, Mechlapaloa y Camiac
Now I'm
Paquilistli.
speaking my language.
Buenas tardes.
Good
Les saludo
afternoon.
con mucho afecto.
I'd like to say hello very warmly.
De Chicolistli UNESCO, Itlascamatilia Pampa Nechnostok
I'm speaking my language again about UNESCO.
Nechicolistli Tlamachtiloyan. Agradezco a la
I would
UNESCO
like to
la
thank
invitación para
UNESCO
participar
for my
en este
invitation
importante
to take
seminario.
part in this seminar
Y panquetzin kawit, nehuatl neki
in my
nishneshtis,
language
se
again.
otli tlenitoka yotia timocuepas tochan. En este breve tiempo de que
In this
dispongo,
brief
deseo
time that I have to
comentar mi
speak, I would like to
experiencia
tell you
que
about my
denomino
experience,
timocuepas tochan, el
which I'm
regreso a casa.
calling coming home.
Los últimos talleres que he impartido sobre
last
educación
two workshops that I've
intercultural
given about
y literatura
intercultural
náhuatl
education and
le he dado
Nahuatl
este
literature,
nombre, esta
I've called it
denominación,
I've called it
Timocuepas
coming home.
Tochan. Hoy, a raíz de la pandemia
Today,
originada por
because
el
of the pandemic that
COVID-19 que nos
COVID-19
tiene
brought
confinados
us,
en nuestras
that
propias
has
casas y
confined us to our own
familias,
homes with
me
our own
resulta
households.
más evidente esta
I think it's
metáfora,
a
Timocuepas
very
Tochan, el
evident
regreso a casa.
metaphor that we're coming home.
Efectivamente, el
In
regreso a
fact,
casa es una
coming
metáfora que me
home is a
permite
metaphor
explicar
that
que
enables
se
me to
trata de la
explain
llegada a la
that
cima de la
we're
montaña para
coming to the
contemplar
top of the
un nuevo
mountain to look
horizonte,
at
es
a
decir,
new horizon.
un horizonte
That is
social
a social
multicolor,
horizon of many
multilingüe
colors,
y
of many
pluricultural.
languages and many cultures.
Desde mi propia matriz cultural,
From my
es
own
decir,
cultural
desde mi
matrix,
propio mundo,
from my
que en
own
lengua
world,
náhuatl
which
nombramos
in the Nahuatl world
Xictlelhuayo,
we call
nuestras raíces antiguas,
our
nuestras raíces milenarias.
old roots, our
Es un
age-old
punto
roots.
de llegada, es cierto,
This is
pero también es un punto de
an arrival
partida
point, but
hacia
also a
un nuevo
departure point
proyecto
toward a
civilizatorio
new
que será
effort to civilize
planetario y
our
global
planet,
de aquí en
our
adelante.
globe.
Hace
From here
500
on,
años,
500
el
years
territorio
ago,
llamado continente
the
americano
territory called
sufrió
the
un colapso
Americas
civilizatorio.
had a civilization
Los pueblos
collapse.
originarios de estas
The native
tierras
peoples in these lands
dejaron o abandonaron su propio ser
abandoned
para
their
adoptar el
own
modelo
efforts
del ser
and
traído de Europa.
adopted the model brought from Europe.
5 siglos después,
5 centuries later,
los pueblos de este continente
the peoples of
americano
this American
están despertando
continent
para
are
buscar y
awakening
desarrollar su
to
propio ser
look for
desde sus
and
propias
find our own
lógicas
way of being
y
and our own
sistemas de
logic
pensamiento.
and our own systems
Esto
of
es,
thinking.
desde su propia visión del
So
mundo,
from their own
que se
vision of the
interrumpió,
world
como ya
that
dije,
was interrupted
hace 5 siglos.
500
Cuando
years
oigo
ago.
a Irma, cuando oigo a
When I hear
Enrique, cuando podemos
Enrique,
oír muchos hermanos de
when we
México y de
can hear
América
many of our
Latina que
friends
desde sus
and
propios
brothers and
pueblos
sisters
nos
from the
hacen
Latin America,
este cuestionamiento,
they
nos hacemos
ask
este
this
cuestionamiento.
question from our
Esto
own
que estoy
peoples.
exponiendo ahora
I'm saying this
pareciera
today,
ser una disertación
and it would seem
académica
to be
especializada
an
o
academic
una
speech.
cátedra filosófica, pero no lo
Maybe I
es.
could be giving a lecture, but
Soy
it's
poeta,
not.
es cierto, pero no
I'm a poet,
filósofo de
that's true, but I'm
Occidente
not
o de Europa.
a philosopher
Más
from
bien
Europe.
poeta y campesino de la
I'm
náhuatl, que
a
forma parte
Nahuatl
del territorio de
country
América.
poet. This is
Un
part
ser
of my
humano que desea
American land.
regresar a su
A
propia
human
casa
being who wants to go
para
home,
cultivar su propio
grow
sustento,
his
su
own
propio
food,
alimento,
his
en
own
fin, cultivar y
sustenance,
desarrollar
and
su
grow and
propia
develop
lengua y cultura
their own
desde
language
su
and
propio
culture
yo, desde
from
su
their
propio
own
ser,
self, their own being,
para explicar
to explain
esta idea amplia que he
this
desplegado, que estoy
ample idea that
desplegando
I'm
en tan poco
developing
tiempo.
here. In
Quiero
such a short
decir
time, I
que
would
este
like to
aprendizaje
tell you
es el
that
resultado de un
this
caminar de
learning
52
is the
años
result
como
of
participante de las
52
ceremonias
years
tradicionales de
in
mi comunidad náhuatl
traditional
de la
ceremonies in my
Huasteca
Nahuatl
Veracruzana, ceremonia
community.
que celebramos y
This
organizamos
ceremony,
cada
which
año
we hold
en
and
torno
organize
al
every year
maíz que
about to
denominamos
celebrate
Chicome Xochitl,
corn,
7 flores.
maize,
Para
the
nosotros
maize with
el
7
maíz
flowers.
es nuestro
Maize
cuerpo y nuestra sangre
is our body
que
and
nos da
our
vida.
blood. Maize, corn gives us
También es el
our
resultado de
life.
otro largo camino que he
This is
recorrido
also
por
the
más de
result of a
50
long
años
pathway that
como
we've taken
maestro
for 50
bilingüe
years
y
as a
también como
bilingual teacher,
tlacuiloane, es decir,
and
escritor
from
en mi
my
propia
own
lengua
tongue,
náhuatl. Y en
a
los
writer
últimos
in my
20
own
años,
language.
como
In the last
profesor
20
de
years
la
as a
Universidad
professor
Nacional
of the
Autónoma de
National
México,
University of
en
Mexico,
donde imparto las
where
materias
I
de
give the subjects
educación
of
intercultural bilingüe para
intercultural
todos los
bilingual
mexicanos,
education for
retos y
all
desafíos, y también el
Mexicans who
tema
are studying
de
here, and
literatura en
also
lenguas indígenas.
literature in indigenous
Por las
languages.
razones que he expresado,
For the reasons that I have
resulta
mentioned,
claro ahora,
it's
más que
clear
ayer,
now,
que
more than
Occidente, que
yesterday,
llegó a América hace
that
500 años a imponer
when the West
su
came to
propio
the
sistema
Americas
de
and imposed their
pensamiento,
own way of thinking,
ha llegado a una profunda
this
crisis como
has caused a
paradigma de
profound
desarrollo y de
crisis
educación
and
en
paradigm
América
of
Latina.
development and
Frente
education
a esta
in
nueva
Latin
realidad,
America.
el
Vis-a-vis
gran
this new
dilema y
reality,
desafío de los pueblos
the great
originarios de
dilemma,
América
the
consiste
challenge
en
for the
recuperar
native peoples
su
of the
propio
Americas is to
sistema de pensamiento,
recover our
como
own
ha
way of
dicho aquí
thinking,
Enrique,
as
sus
Enrique said,
propias lógicas
our own
del
ways of thinking,
conocimiento
our
y su
logic,
propia visión
our
del mundo.
knowledge, and
Yo he
vision
dicho
of the
en los
world.
últimos años que en
In the
México,
last
pero puede
few
ser
years
válido para cualquier
in
país de
Mexico,
América
but for
Latina,
any country in
desde
Latin
el
America,
preescolar hasta la universidad,
from
nos
preschool
educamos
to
como
the
si fuéramos
university, we're educated
europeos
as if we
y
were
solamente
Europeans,
las
and
tradiciones,
only the
todo este
traditions,
patrimonio cultural
all of this
inmaterial que ahora estamos
intangible cultural heritage that we're
comentando
talking
es
about
lo que nos
today,
hace ser
that's
mexicanos,
what makes
chilenos,
us
argentinos,
Mexican, Chilean,
distintos en
Argentine,
Europa. pero nuestro
different
modelo
from Europe.
educativo, nuestros
But our
paradigmas
educational
educativos son
model, our
occidentales,
educational
ni
paradigms
siquiera
are
orientales,
Western,
porque si fuéramos
not even
orientales, yo creo que
Oriental.
nos
If we were
permitiría
Oriental, maybe that would
reflexionar
help us.
más en
We could
empatía
reflect
con
better
Oriente que con
and
Occidente.
better empathy
Son
with the East
otras
than with
visiones
the
del
West.
mundo, las
There
de
are other
Occidente.
worldviews.
En fin, en este
So,
contexto,
in this
mi
context,
modesta
my
recomendación y
modest
sugerencia
recommendation and
para la
suggestion
agenda de desarrollo
for the
post-COVID-19 consiste
post-COVID-19
en romper los
development
paradigmas
agenda
del
is to
pensamiento
break
occidental
out
que aquí
of
hemos
the
escuchado
Western
ampliamente. Y no es que no
thinking
sirvan,
paradigms that we've
han
heard about.
servido, pero
They're
no es
not,
solo eso
it's
lo que
not that they're not
necesitamos después
useful,
de la
but
pandemia.
that's not
¿sí?
all we
Necesitamos
need
regresar a
after the
nuestros propios
pandemic. We need to
paradigmas,
get
los
back to
pueblos
our own
de
paradigms for
América
the
Latina, los pueblos
peoples of the Latin
ancestrales de
America,
América
the
Latina.
ancestral peoples of the Americas.
Repito,
I'd
mi
like to
propuesta
repeat
consiste
that
en
my
romper los
proposal is
paradigmas del
to break
pensamiento
the
occidental
thinking paradigms
fuertemente
of the
arraigados
West
en América
that are
Latina
so
para
deep-rooted in Latin
participar
America,
en la construcción
and we have
juntos,
to
y aquí yo diría
build
juntos,
together.
no los
I would say
especialistas
together,
académicos por su
not
lado
the
y
academic
nosotros por
scholars, the
otro,
specialists on the one
en
side and
esta
the other
doble
people on the
vía
other
que está
side,
soñando,
in a
imaginando Enrique Pérez
two-way
López, de ida y de
dream that
regreso,
Enrique Perez is talking
para
about, the
generar
two-way
juntos
back and forth.
un nuevo modelo
We have to generate
civilizatorio
a new
desde el
civilization
pensamiento y
model
los saberes de los pueblos
from the
originarios de América
knowledge
Latina
of the original
que
people, the
cuentan
native
con una
people
memoria
of Latin
ancestral
America,
por lo
who have
menos de
ancestral memory
5.000 años.
of at least
El Instituto
5,000
Nacional de
years.
Antropología,
The National Institute of Anthropology,
Instituto Nacional de Antropología e
of
Historia,
Anthropology and History,
conocido por siglas el INA de México, tiene
Mexico's
testimonios
institute,
de esta
has
civilización,
testimonials
testimonios
of
materiales,
the
las ciudades
material
antiguas que muchos de
civilization of
ustedes
the
han
old
visitado,
cities that
de
many of you
5.000
have
años.
visited.
Europa
From
tiene
5,000
500
years,
años en América.
Europe has 500
Europa
years
es
that
antigua
it's
ya
been
en
in
su
the
propio territorio, en
Americas.
su propio en América
Europe
tiene
is
500
old
años.
in
La
Europe,
civilización maya
but it's
tiene
only
500
500
años.
years old
La
here.
civilización
Our native
náhuatl 500 años. La
civilizations are
civilización de los
5,000 years
hermanos
old.
quechos y hermanas tiene
The
5.000 años.
other
¿no?
native peoples
Termino
have existed
diciendo,
for thousands of years.
este es, en mi
I'd like to
opinión, el
end
gran
by
reto
saying
y
that
desafío
this
que
is our great
tenemos
challenge
todos en América
that we
Latina o
all
América
have
en
in Latin
general,
America and
en
in
el nuevo
general
horizonte
in
del desarrollo
Latin America,
en
in the
nuestra
new
América Latina
design of
después de la
development in Latin
pandemia
America
originada por el
after the
COVID-19.
pandemic
Las Kamate,
originated by
Melawak, Tlaxcamate.
COVID-19.
Muchas
Again, in my
gracias a la
language,
UNESCO,
thank
a
you very
Carlos,
much
a los colegas que
to
me escuchan,
UNESCO, to
por esta
Carlos, to my
oportunidad
colleagues
de
for
reflexionar juntos e
bearing with me
imaginar juntos
for this
nuestra América
opportunity to
Latina
reflect with
después
each
del
other and reflect
COVID-19. A su
together
cama.
about COVID-19. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, maestro Natalio.
Thank you, Master Natalio.
Irma Pineda hablaba de cómo
Irma has talked about
instituciones de educación
how
interculturales han ido cambiando
intercultural educational institutions, schools, have changed the ways that
académicos.
we do our academic work.
Enrique Pérez López habla de
Enrique Perez
investigación de
talked about
doble vía.
two-way research. Master Natalio Hernandez has talked about the need to change and expand our paradigms for educational models. Before that, we were talking about Sambuco, about bridges.
Enrique Pérez López habla
Enrique Perez has told us about
Natalio Hernández habla del
Natalio has talked about in their own languages,
anteriormente Patricia San Martín y todo el equipo
and Patricia and the team were talking about dialogue among different kinds of knowledge. So I'd like to ask one more question in the sense that Maria Frick was asking. Higher education and intercultural heritage networks. We have the context of a decade of indigenous languages. Next year, in 2021, we have the international language for the creative economy for sustainable development. We have in 2022, we have the second World Conference on Cultural Policy. we're going to have a post-COVID scenario. So, taking what Natalia has mentioned about joint construction to build it together, what recommendation would you like to make to find our common ground to carry forward in the collectively building? I'm going to begin with Irma.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Thank
Pues
you.
más bien creo que
Rather,
me ha tocado ver que ya se está
I
dando esta construcción
think that we're already
entre
building
académicos
together
y
between
las
academicians and communities when we were talking about this a while ago.
parte de lo que están contribuyendo las instituciones, las universidades,
Through the universities and institutions
propiciar este
to
reconocimiento
favor this
de cuáles son
recognition
sus elementos
of the community's own elements that come into these elements of intangible cultural heritage, to work with the community to develop the projects. I think that's the direction,
ya es tiempo de
because
que nos dejen de ver
it's
solamente
time for us to
solamente
stop being viewed as mere informants
más bien
or study
el
subjects,
desarrollo de cualquier
but to favor the development of any projects
mismas comunidades en conjunto con
from communities,
entonces
along with the
otra de las
community.
cosas en las que debemos evitar caer
Another thing that we have to avoid falling into is the central focus. This has affected us greatly, that when we validate what, when we evaluate institutions are doing more than the community, and we minimize the work of higher education institutions in localities, I think that this has to change. I'd like to take advantage of this, the University for Different Languages, or native languages. We say we have to create a new institution in the center of the country, and what about the rest of the regions? This is something we have to review. But I think here is where we have to work to recognize the work of higher education institutions in each region and locality that are being created by indigenous groups. In Oaxaca, they're building the community university, which is working closely with the people. I think these are the kind of practices that we have to take into account and consider. Thank you. Thank you, Irma. They're warning me that our Facebook is over in 12 minutes. So I'd like to ask you to be very quickly in Enrique and Natalia. Can you tell me? Very quickly. This way of thinking about working together, to work together, to learn together. We've already proposed this in the process of dialogue among different kinds of knowledge. We have to recover and discuss between community knowledge and knowledge from other cultures as well, to interlink and understand this way of rethinking people's existence. I think that higher education institutions have to include in their study programs cross-cutting themes of cultural heritage in its broadest sense. It doesn't hurt a dentist to know about, or an engineer, it doesn't hurt them to know about cultural heritage or intangible heritage. I think this would be one way to build a new generation, educate a new generation who are going to be the ones who will continue with the cultural elements that give us identity today. Thank you, Enrique. Natalia.
Querido Carlos, ¿cuántos minutos
Dear
me
Carlos, how many
quedan
minutes do I
al
have left?
final
like about two.
No, yo creo que aquí también hay una asimetría. O sea, al
there's
final nosotros
imbalance.
nos quedamos con 2
Ultimately,
minutos, 5
We had
minutos,
2 minutes
cuando
left, 5
los
minutes left,
especialistas han llevado
when the
bastante,
specialists have
bastante
taken
tiempo. Pero en fin,
a
voy
longer
a
time.
ajustarme a 5
But anyway,
minutos.
I'll hold
Primero,
myself to 5 minutes.
decir que en México hay
First of all, to say that in Mexico,
distintos niveles de
we have
trabajar
different
juntos, caminar juntos.
levels of
No
working
tengo mucho
together, of
tiempo para
walking
explicar,
together.
pero
I can't explain
haré
this
el
in
esfuerzo.
depth, but I'll make it
Con la UNESCO hemos caminado
With
juntos
UNESCO, we
desde
have
el
worked together
1998,
since
porque en México se
1998,
presentó el
because in
informe
Mexico,
sobre cultura en
the report on culture
97
was
y
given in
luego
1997.
allí hemos seguido juntos
And we've
en
been working
esta
together
idea de,
with this idea of
de diálogo, primero de reconocimiento
dialogue, of
de la
recognition,
riqueza de la diversidad
of
cultural, a
the
partir de la
richness
Declaración
of
2001
cultural
de la
diversity,
UNESCO. Y en
the
este
wealth of
paraguas,
cultural diversity. In
digamos,
this
académico y de
academic
política de la
umbrella,
diversidad
the
cultural
policy
como
of
patrimonio de la
cultural diversity
humanidad de la
as
UNESCO, se
heritage of
construyeron,
humankind,
se crearon las
we have
universidades
created the
interculturales.
intercultural
Algunas han
universities.
funcionado bien en esta
Some have
perspectiva,
operated from
¿no?
this
Porque
standpoint.
faltan cuadros que sean los
Because
mediadores culturales de
there are
contextos de
cultural
diversidad
mediators
lingüística y cultural.
who are,
Pero la UNAM, por ejemplo, también
we
creó
need more.
el
But
programa
the
México Nación
National University
Multicultural
has also
y hay
created a program
materias
of
transversales, como ha
intercultural
planteado
education.
Enrique,
And
para
there are
todas las
cross-cutting
facultades de la
themes,
UNAM,
as
en
Enrique
lengua,
said, for
en
all
cultura, en
areas
educación
of
indígena, en saberes
the
indígenas,
languages for
derechos
indigenous
indígenas.
cultures,
Y
for
yo creo que es un
indigenous
ejemplo y
rights.
un modelo para
I
América
think this
Latina.
is
Yo,
an
que
example
yo
and a
sepa,
model for
creo que
Latin
no hay
America.
ninguna universidad,
I
o
don't know if
habrá
there's
algunas
any
otras, pero yo
university, maybe
desconozco,
there's some
en
more,
América Latina.
in Latin America.
Podemos poner varios ejemplos. Este es
We
un
can give a
primer
number of
nivel,
examples.
digamos, a
This is the
nivel
first level,
universitario. Pero
at the
también
university
tenemos
level, but we also
experiencias
have
más a nivel
experience
personal. En México
at a
tenemos la
personal level.
fortuna
In
de
Mexico,
haber
we have the
caminado
good
juntos, por
fortune
ejemplo, con
of
Carlos
having worked
Montemayor,
together with
un helenista y
Carlos
latinista
Monte,
que nos
Greek and
acompañó
Latin
y
scholar
caminó con nosotros
who
dando conferencias y
worked with
talleres.
us,
De
giving
manera
us,
particular, trabajó
giving
con los
lectures.
hermanos mayas,
He worked
20
with the
años dando
Mayans
talleres.
for 20 years, giving
Al final,
workshops,
él aprendió maya. Y
and
dijo al
learned the Mayan
final,
language.
ahora
At
descubro
the end of the day, he
que
said,
los
I
pueblos
discovered
mayas nos pueden
that the
enseñar
Mayan
muchas
peoples
cosas. A
can
mí
teach
me
us
han
many
transformado
things.
porque ahora entiendo que soy
They've
apenas un
changed
pequeño
me. They've
y
transformed
una
me.
pequeña luz dentro del universo, ¿no? He
Because
hablado con
I
los
know
sabios
that I'm only a
mayas
light
que
in the
no han ido a la
universe.
universidad,
I've
pero que
spoken of the
guardan el
Mayan,
pensamiento maya
wise.
antiguo y son
The
sabios.
elders of
El
the
otro
Mayans
ejemplo es
are
don
very
Miguel León
wise.
Portilla, que
Another
también
one is
al final de su
Miguel
vida, la
Portilla.
sociedad
At the
mexicana
end of the day,
lo reconoció como tlamatini, que
Mexican
quiere decir
society
sabio en lengua náhuatl. Él escribió
recognized
la
him
filosofía
as
náhuatl,
a
aprendió
wise
náhuatl
man.
y
He
dejó un
learned
vasto
Nahuatl
acervo cultural,
and left a
ya no
cultural
con la mirada desde
body
Occidente,
of
sino
knowledge, not
una
only
mirada
from the
desde
Western
dentro de la
standpoint, but
cultura
also from
mesoamericana.
within
Él nos
inside the
legó
Middle
un poema
American
universal que se llama
model.
Icuectlastole Yembique,
He wrote a poem
la Xecua Totlacayotipa. Cuando muere una lengua, la humanidad
saying
se
that
empobrece.
when a language
Son
dies,
ejemplos que cito porque
humankind
son
is
los más
poorer.
visibles de cómo
These are the
desde
most
la
visible
universidad
ones.
el investigador,
From
el
the
académico
university,
puede caminar junto con nosotros para ir construyendo
communities
este
and
piso
scholars
de
can work
diálogo,
together to
de
build this
entendimiento y de
foundation
construcción
for
de un
dialogue,
nuevo
understanding,
modelo de
and building
sociedad, en
a
donde la
new
riqueza
model
de
for
la
a society
diversidad
where
cultural
the
nos
wealth
permea a
of
todos, no
cultural
solo a la población
diversity
mestiza
can permeate us all,
mayoritaria como ha
not just
sido
the mestizo
históricamente.
majority,
Y finalmente termino
as
mencionando algunos ejemplos
it
de
has
cómo
always
estas
been. And I
experiencias
mentioned
de caminar
examples
juntos que han
of how
planteado
these
Irma
experiences
y
of
Enrique
working together, of
están
walking together,
desarrollándose en
that
los
Irma and
pueblos. Voy a
Enrique have
mencionar
said are
dos que
developing in the
tres.
peoples.
Ustedes
I'll
conocen,
mention a
Carlos,
couple.
desde la UNESCO,
You know, Carlos,
el
in
Centro de
UNESCO,
Culturas Indígenas, el
about the
CAI de
Indigenous
Papantla,
Center
dentro del
in
territorio
Papantla,
totonaco, que ha
in
sido
Totonaco,
reconocida la experiencia
which has
como
been
buenas
recognized
prácticas
as
educativas desde
a
la
good
visión
educational
comunitaria.
practice from the
Pero podemos
community
encontrar muchos más.
standpoint, but we can find many
La
more.
Escuela de Música de los
This
Mijes de Oaxaca,
School
en
of
donde
Music
terminan el
of the people
bachillerato
in
no
Oaxaca,
solo
where they finish their high
una
school,
formación académica
not
escolarizada,
just
sino también como
in
músicos
school,
que
but also
recuperan la
as
tradición
musicians
de sus
who
pueblos
know
y
their
también
people's
leen
tradition,
e interpretan música de
and they can
Occidente. Es decir,
make
estamos
Western
hablando de
music
una
as well.
generación abierta al mundo
This
desde
is
su propia raíz.
a
Tenemos
generation
otra
that's open to the
experiencia,
world from their own roots.
que tiene por lo
We have an
menos
experience which
casi
is
50 años,
almost 50
más de
years,
40 años.
over
De
40 years
experiencia que se
of
llama
experience
Tosepantitatanisque,
called
que quiere decir juntos
Tosepantitatanisque,
ganaremos,
which
juntos
says
nos
we will all
desarrollaremos,
win
que está en la
together, we
región
will all
náhuatl,
develop together.
Totonaca de
It's in
Coetzalan,
the
Puebla. Ellos han
Nahuatl
logrado
area
a lo
where
largo de
they
40 años
have
crear
achieved
su
over
propio
40 years
sistema
to
educativo
create
comunitario, que va
a
desde
community
preescolar
education system
hasta el
from
bachillerato por
preschool
lo menos, ¿no?
to
En fin,
high
podemos
school at
mencionar
least.
el proyecto
So
del
we can
bosque
mention
entre los
the
purépechas de San
Forest
Juan Nuevo,
Project
que a lo
in
largo de
New
40
San
años han
Juan.
generado sus
Over
propios
40 years,
cuadros
they've
técnicos y
created their own
profesionales.
technical
Tienen
teams and their own
ingenieros,
credentials.
tienen,
They have
en fin,
engineers,
especialistas que
they have
conocen el
specialists
campo,
who
¿no? El medio
know
ambiente que les
about the
permite
countryside and the
reciclar la
environment to
producción de la
recycle
madera. Termino aquí
lumber
diciendo,
production.
efectivamente, Timocuepas
I
Tocha,
will add by saying in my
ya te
language,
atreviste a pronunciarlo, el regreso a casa implica a
coming
regresar
home
a la matriz cultural
is
de
to
América Latina,
come to the
milenaria,
cultural matrix
y
of
que
Latin
esta
America.
cultura que nos llegó
We've
hace
existed for
500 años debe
thousands of years,
servirnos
and this new
también
culture from
para
500 years
mirar
ago can
juntos un
be
nuevo
useful to
horizonte
us to
cultural,
look at a
en
new
donde todos
cultural horizon
nos
where
desarrollemos desde
we can
nuestro
all
propio
develop
ser
from our
individual
own
y desde nuestro propio
being
ser colectivo,
individually
como lo
and
piensan y
collectively
lo sigue
the
viviendo
way we
nuestros
think
pueblos.
and the way we live.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Pues muchas gracias, maestro Natalio. Ya con esto
Thank you, Natalia. With this, we're going to make a conclusion. And with this invitation to look together, we're ending this panel. Thank you very much. And I'll give the floor to Maria Frick. Carlos, maybe you can close this out. We have like less than a minute because the YouTube is going to cut us off. What do you think
Cerramos el 2020
about how we can close out the year 2020 with this reflection? What can we say now, those of us who are here? I think my conclusion is that the challenge is to find a way to establish and accept two-way dialogue and think that what the 2030 agenda or sustainable development, what it advocates is to change things, the way we do things radically, not just inclusion of communities and peoples, but transforming with them and with their ways of thinking and the hegemonic ways that things are done, including education and research. I think it has to be a radical transformation of our ways of being. Thank you, Carlos. And with those closing words, I think we have a lot to say. Thank you very much. We're an hour over, so thank you for staying with us. Thank you again for being with us for this project and celebration of the work that we did and that our region is doing. And that thank you for accompanying us. Thank you to everybody. Thank you to UNESCO Mexico for celebrating with us. Thank you to Maria and Antonio. Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you, Boram and Jacob and Enrique and Natal and Frederick, everybody. Thank you to everybody. Thank you very much.
Felicidades.
Happy New Year.
Gracias,
Happy New Year.
Frederick, Carlos, Cintia, todos.
Thank you to everybody.